What happens when the smartest man in the universe becomes so certain he's right that he stops paying attention? Think about that for a second. Not the kind of question you can answer quickly, because on the surface, you'd expect someone with Rick Sanchez's mind to never have a blind spot. He can build a portal gun in a garage. He's survived encounters with gods. He's outsmarted bureaucracies that span entire galaxies and laughed while doing it. When Rick walks into a room, he's already calculated the 17 different ways the situation could go wrong and has a contingency plan for each one. And yet, some of his most significant failures, the ones that actually cost him something, didn't come from a smarter enemy. They didn't come from superior technology or a plan he couldn't predict. They came from something almost embarrassingly simple. He looked at the people around him and decided he already knew exactly what they were capable of. That assumption, that one quiet, automatic assumption, it followed him across dimensions, across timelines, across the entire run of the show, and every single time it came back around, it cost him more than he expected to pay. There's a version of confidence that's useful, essential even. To do what Rick does, to walk through a portal into an alien civilization and immediately start renegotiating the terms of your survival, you need a baseline certainty about your own abilities. Doubt would get him killed before the opening credits finished rolling. His confidence isn't just arrogance for the sake of arrogance. It's functional. It keeps him alive. But there's a threshold you cross somewhere, and Rick crossed it a long time ago, where confidence stops being a tool and becomes a lens, a filter over reality. You stop asking what's actually happening here and start asking, how does this fit what I already know? The calculation becomes faster and faster until it's not really a calculation anymore. It's a reflex, a snap judgment dressed up in the language of intelligence. Rick Sanchez has been doing this so long he doesn't even notice it happening. When he looks at Morty, he sees a nervous kid. When he looks at Jerry, he sees a walking punchline. When he looks at Summer, he sees someone who isn't part of the equation. When he looks at Beth, he sees a reflection of himself, which ironically means he doesn't quite see Beth at all. He sees what he expects to see. He fills in the blanks before the blanks have a chance to show him anything. This is the trap that genius builds for itself. Psychology has a concept called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which most people know in its pop science form. The idea that incompetent people overestimate their abilities because they lack the knowledge to recognize their own limitations. But the original research had a second, quieter finding that people talk about less. Highly competent people tend to underestimate themselves because they assume tasks that come easily to them must come easily to everyone. Rick doesn't have that problem. He knows he's exceptional. But there's a related trap on the other end, the trap of expertise that closes a person off from surprise. When you've spent decades being the smartest person in every situation, you develop shortcuts. You pattern match. You see a Jerry-shaped situation and you apply the Jerry solution without stopping to check whether Jerry actually fits that pattern today. The world keeps changing. People keep growing. Rick keeps filing them under the same categories he built years ago, and eventually, those categories stop being accurate. But Rick doesn't update them. It's worth asking why. Why does someone with an intellect that can literally rewrite the laws of physics fail to apply that same rigor to the people he sees every day? Part of the answer is emotional. Rick's relationship with other people, particularly his family, is built on a foundation of pain he never fully processed. Diane's death, Rick Prime, the years he spent moving through infinite versions of a life he never quite got to live. Somewhere in all of that, Rick made a decision, maybe conscious, maybe not, to keep people at a calculable distance, to understand them rather than to be surprised by them. Because being surprised by someone means they had the capacity to affect you in ways you didn't anticipate. And that's dangerous. If you already know what someone is going to do, you're never caught off guard. You're never hurt. You're always the one in control. The underestimation is protective. That's the thing the show quietly reveals over time. When Rick dismisses Morty or rolls his eyes at Jerry or checks out when Summer starts talking about something she cares about, it's not purely because he thinks they're beneath him. It's because building a detailed, updated, genuinely accurate model of who they are would require him to care in a way that leaves him exposed. And Rick Sanchez does not like being exposed, so he keeps the models simple. Deliberately, maybe unconsciously, simple. Let's talk about what overconfidence actually looks like in practice, because it's not always loud. With Rick, it rarely announces itself. It's not chest beating. It's quieter than that. It's the sigh before someone else speaks. The way he starts explaining something before the other person has finished their sentence. The casual assumption that whatever Morty just suggested is wrong, not because Rick has evaluated it, but because Morty suggested it. It's the eye roll at Jerry that happens before Jerry has even fully committed to whatever he's about to say. It's the way Rick moves through conversations like they're formalities, things he has to endure on the way to the part where he already knows the answer. This is what makes it so easy to miss watching the show, because it's packaged inside humor. Jerry says something and Rick shoots it down, and it's funny, because Rick is funnier and faster and more interesting to watch, and so we laugh along with Rick and move on. But the pattern underneath all of that humor is doing something. It's building a portrait of a man who has genuinely stopped looking at the people he loves. Not stopped loving them necessarily, stopped looking. There's a difference. Season 1 doesn't hide this. It's right there from almost the beginning. Rick brings Morty along on his adventures because he needs a companion. He says as much, framed in pseudoscientific terms about brainwaves and camouflage, but what's actually happening is Rick needs someone beside him. He's lonely in a way he doesn't have language for. But even as he brings Morty along, even as he keeps choosing to return to this family, he keeps relating to Morty through a hierarchy. I'm the genius. You're the sidekick. I make the calls, you follow. And for a while, Morty does follow, because he's 14 and scared, and Rick is overwhelming in every possible way. But Morty doesn't stay 14. He doesn't stay scared, and Rick, somewhere along the way, forgot to update his read on him. Think about how rare it is to genuinely not know what someone you're close to is capable of. Most of us, even without Rick's intelligence, constantly revise our models of the people around us. Someone surprises you at work. You update. Someone you thought was weak shows up in a crisis. You update. It's a natural, low-effort cognitive process. Humans do it almost automatically. Rick has the computing power to model entire civilizations, and yet he applies almost none of that capacity to modeling his own family accurately. He keeps them frozen, static images of who they were when he first categorized them. The technical term for this in cognitive psychology is functional fixedness, a phenomenon where past understanding of something blocks you from seeing its new potential. Scientists find it everywhere, but it appears in relationships too. You stop seeing the person and start seeing your memory of the person. For Rick, that memory is fixed somewhere early. Morty is always the nervous kid. Jerry is always the useless husband. Summer is always peripheral. Beth is always the daughter who needed him. None of those things are fully true anymore. Maybe they never were. There's also something specific about the way Rick's intelligence works that makes this worse. He's not just smart, he's fast. He processes at a speed that means by the time most people are halfway through forming a thought, Rick has already evaluated, dismissed, and moved on from 3 or 4 possible responses. That speed is extraordinary. It's also, in the context of other people, occasionally devastating, because real understanding of another person requires patience. It requires being willing to sit with ambiguity, to let someone take their time, to resist the urge to finish their sentence and start seeing them in their full, unresolved, complicated reality. Rick doesn't do ambiguity well. Rick does solutions. Rick does answers. The moment he has a working model, he acts on it. But people aren't problems with solutions. People are ongoing processes, and you can't solve a process, you can only stay current with it. Rick has been running a years-old model of his family on hardware that could build a multiverse, and wondering why the outputs keep surprising him. Rick's identity is the key to all of this, not just his intelligence as a trait, but his intelligence as the thing he has decided is the whole of who he is. There's no Rick behind the genius. Or if there is, Rick isn't letting anyone see him, possibly including himself. This is what makes the underestimation so loaded. When Rick looks at Morty and sees a lesser mind, he's not just making a factual assessment about IQ, he's protecting a story he tells about himself. The story that says Rick Sanchez is exceptional and irreplaceable and several levels above the people around him. That story is what makes the loneliness bearable. If he can be certain he's above everyone else, he can explain away the distance between himself and everyone else. Season by season, the show keeps testing this. It keeps putting Rick in situations where his certainty is specifically the thing that fails him. Not his intelligence, his certainty. The difference is crucial, and the show understands it well. Rick's intellect is almost never the problem. What goes wrong is when he mistakes his model of a situation for the actual situation. And the people who break through, the ones who manage to genuinely surprise him, to change the equation, to operate outside the boundaries Rick assigned them, they all have one thing in common. They stop trying to meet Rick on his terms. They stopped arguing on his level, trying to prove themselves through the metrics he respects. They simply kept growing, kept making their own choices, kept being more than what he'd decided they were. And eventually that growth became undeniable. That's the through line of this documentary. That's what connects every chapter, every character, every moment. Rick's greatest flaw isn't that he's arrogant, exactly. It's that his arrogance is self-sealing. It explains away all the evidence against it. Every time someone surprises him, he doesn't revise the model. He categorizes the surprise as a fluke, an exception, a lucky break, until the exceptions pile up so high that even Rick can't ignore them anymore. And by then, it's usually too late to change what the underestimation already cost him. The smartest man in the universe has a recurring problem. He keeps meeting people he's already met before. The same Morty, the same Jerry, the same Beth and Summer. Old images walking around in new situations. And those people keep not being what he expects. They keep being more. Chapter 2. The Morty Rick Never Expected. There's a version of this story where Morty Smith stays exactly who he was in the pilot. Nervous, easily overwhelmed, stuttering through sentences while Rick drags him through situations his nervous system was never built to handle. A boy who got pulled into an adventure because his grandfather needed a companion and he was the most available option. That's the role Morty was handed. Sidekick, emotional ballast. The specific frequency of anxiety that apparently makes Rick's brainwaves harder to detect. That's the version Rick kept expecting for a very long time. The show had other plans. Let's go back to the beginning, because the beginning is important, and it's easy to rush past it when you already know how the story ends. In the pilot episode, Rick explains to Morty, in the specific condescending shorthand Rick uses when he's technically sharing information but not actually including you in anything, that Morty's brainwaves cancel out his genius waves. Together, they're invisible to the people hunting for Rick. Separately, Rick is a target. Morty is bait. That's the arrangement. That's the whole arrangement. Rick isn't bringing Morty along because he sees potential. He's bringing Morty along because Morty is useful, in a very mechanical, replaceable way. The relationship isn't built on belief in Morty. It's built on the fact that Morty's particular flavor of ordinary is, paradoxically, what makes Rick extraordinary. From day one, Rick's model of Morty is almost entirely defined by what Morty is not. Not smart enough, not capable enough, not experienced enough, not ready for any of the things Rick regularly drags him into. And because Rick's model of Morty starts there, at limitation, at absence, at everything Morty lacks, it becomes very difficult for Rick to see what Morty actually has. What Morty actually has is something Rick spent so long cataloging the absence of that he nearly missed its presence entirely. Morty has moral clarity. Not perfect moral clarity, not consistent, unwavering, never gets complicated moral clarity, but a baseline orientation toward other people, toward their suffering, their dignity, their personhood, that Rick simply doesn't lead with. When Morty sees someone in pain, his first instinct is to help. When Rick sees someone in pain, his first instinct is to assess, to calculate, to determine whether the pain is relevant to whatever he's trying to accomplish. This looks like weakness. In the context of interdimensional adventure, an instinct toward compassion is objectively dangerous. It slows you down, it complicates the calculus, it leads to situations where you're trying to rescue someone from a circumstance that will statistically end badly regardless of your intervention. Rick knows this. He's watched compassion get people killed. So he trained himself out of it, or at least out of showing it, and when he looks at Morty leading with his heart, he sees inefficiency. What he's actually looking at is a different kind of intelligence. Moral intelligence. Emotional intelligence, the kind that tracks not just what's happening, but what things mean to the people experiencing them. The kind that makes Morty, in the long run, a more complete person than Rick in ways that Rick's IQ can't compensate for. Early Morty is hard to watch sometimes, and not in the way the show intends. It's hard to watch because of how small he is, how much space he gives Rick, how quickly he backs down. There's a specific quality to the way early Morty disagrees with Rick. This compressed, apologetic, half-formed protest that trails off before it fully forms, as though Morty knows before he's even finished speaking that Rick isn't going to listen and he might as well save his breath. That's not a character flaw. That's a learned response to being around Rick Sanchez. When you spend enough time around someone who processes faster than you and dismisses you before you're done talking, you start to pre-dismiss yourself. It's efficient. It hurts less. But watch what happens across the seasons. Watch how the protests get longer, how the sentences start finishing, how Morty begins, slowly and then more quickly, to push back in ways that don't collapse the moment Rick applies pressure. This is one of the most underrated arcs in the entire show, not because it isn't noticed, but because it happens gradually enough that you can miss how profound the shift is. Morty doesn't just get braver, he gets more himself, and more himself turns out to be someone Rick genuinely didn't see coming. Season 1 has a moment that doesn't get talked about enough. In Me Seeks and Destroy, Morty gets to pick the adventure. This is framed as Rick being generous, letting Morty have his turn, but watch Rick's energy throughout that episode. There's a specific flavor of condescension Rick deploys. Not loud, not dramatic, just this constant low-grade expectation that Morty's adventure is going to be embarrassing, and he, Rick, is going to be the one who has to clean it up. And in some ways, that expectation gets confirmed. The adventure doesn't go cleanly. Things go wrong in ways Morty didn't predict. But Morty's response to those things going wrong is not what Rick expected. There's a gravity to how Morty carries the consequences of that episode. He doesn't bounce back with a quip. He sits with it. He processes it in a way that's actually more mature than how Rick typically processes consequences, which is to say, Rick usually processes consequences by building a device that removes them. Rick sees the adventure fail and files it under Morty's ideas don't work. He doesn't see what the episode is actually showing, that Morty can absorb failure and stay himself, which is a form of resilience Rick genuinely struggles with. Rick Potion number 9 is the episode where this starts getting serious. Morty asks Rick for a love potion. He wants Jessica to like him. 14-year-old logic, not a great plan. Rick goes along with it because he's certain he can manage the outcome. He's done more complicated chemistry before breakfast. A simple love potion? Please. What happens instead is a cascade of disasters. The potion spreads, mutates, ends with the literal conversion of most of Earth's population into Cronenbergs. An extinction-level event caused by Rick underestimating the complexity of a biological system he thought he had figured out. But the key moment is what happens after. Rick's solution is to find an alternate Earth where they both died before fixing the problem. Transplant themselves into those dead bodies and start over. Functionally, abandon their original universe, replace themselves with corpses, and never speak of it again. Rick explains this plan with the same energy he'd use to explain how to make a sandwich. It's practical, it's solved, move on. And Morty, who just watched his original universe end, who just buried himself in a backyard, starts crying in the car. He realizes what Rick just did, what they just did, what they're now living with. And the weight of that doesn't leave him the way Rick expected it would. Morty carries that. He carries it through the whole show. That capacity, to hold on to what things cost, to not shake it off, to let consequences mean something, is not weakness, it's the beginning of something. A moral seriousness that Rick, who buried his feelings under a detachment so complete it became a personality, doesn't have access to in the same way. The Pickle Rick episode is one of the most talked about in the series, and most of the conversation is about Rick being impressive, because he is. Turning yourself into a pickle to avoid family therapy and then engineering your way out of a sewer and through a building full of armed men is impressive by any metric. Nobody is taking that away from him. But the point of the episode isn't Rick's ingenuity. The point of the episode is what Dr. Wong says in that final scene, that Rick's intelligence isn't his gift, it's his excuse. His ability to solve any external problem means he never has to sit with the internal ones. He can always build a way out, and building a way out is exactly what he did by turning himself into a pickle in the first place. Morty listens to this conversation. He watches Rick get diagnosed by a therapist in 10 minutes in ways Rick would never allow from anyone who actually knows him. And Morty takes it in. Because Morty is doing something Rick has never fully done, he's learning about himself. He's letting experience change him. He's staying present with the uncomfortable parts instead of engineering his way around them. Rick sees Morty going to therapy as Morty being weak, as Morty needing something Rick doesn't need. He doesn't see that what Morty is doing is building the kind of self-knowledge that creates lasting stability, which Rick, famously, has never had. By the middle seasons, there are moments where Morty's judgment is visibly better than Rick's in specific situations, and Rick doesn't like those moments. You can see it. There's a quality Rick gets when Morty is right about something emotional, a slight recalibration, a beat where he adjusts without admitting he's adjusting. He'll act on Morty's read without crediting Morty's read. He'll modify the plan based on what Morty said and then frame the modification as his own evolution of the strategy. This is not a coincidence. This is Rick protecting the hierarchy even as the hierarchy becomes less accurate. Because if Morty is right about this and right about that and keeps having good reads on situations that Rick misread, then what does that mean about the model Rick built? What does it mean about the 10,000 times Rick dismissed a Morty idea before Morty even finished explaining it? It means the model was wrong, and Rick Sanchez does not update models easily, especially not models about the people he loves. The episode The Rick Lantis Mix-Up gives us Evil Morty becoming president. We'll get into Evil Morty in depth in the next chapter, but the relevant thing here, in the context of Morty's arc, is what that storyline says about what Mortys are capable of when given the right circumstances. Every version of Morty on the Citadel has been shaped by a Rick who told him he was lesser, and most of them internalized it, but some of them pushed back. Some of them built something out of resentment and intelligence and the specific pain of being chronically underestimated. Evil Morty is the most extreme version of this, but the existence of that outcome is itself a statement. Take someone you've been dismissing for years and look at what they might become when they stop waiting for your approval. The main Morty isn't Evil Morty. He's not building a long game of revenge, but he's growing. And the direction of his growth is increasingly away from needing Rick's validation to operate. The Season 7 and beyond version of Morty, after the Rick Prime arc shifts the dynamic of the show, after years of interdimensional exposure and moral confrontation and losing and finding himself, this is not the boy from the pilot. This is someone who's been through things. Someone who's processed those things, imperfectly but genuinely. Someone who pushed back on Rick's model of him for long enough that even Rick has had to quietly acknowledge it doesn't fully apply anymore. Rick has never said this out loud. He probably never will. That's not how Rick works, but watch how he looks at Morty in the later seasons. There's something in the look that wasn't in the pilot. It's not quite respect. Rick doesn't do respect cleanly. The word sticks in his throat. But there's a seriousness there, a recognition. A faint but real acknowledgement that this person is someone he can't fully predict. That is enormous, coming from Rick Sanchez. Here's the thing about Morty that Rick's model never captured. Even at the beginning, Morty's greatest strength was never intelligence in the traditional sense. It was never going to compete with Rick on that level, and Morty, to his credit, eventually stopped trying to. What Morty has is endurance. The ability to keep going after things that would be reasonable grounds to stop. To absorb the worst of what the multiverse can do to a person and still show up the next day. Not unchanged, Morty is permanently changed by almost everything that happens to him, which is actually the point. He changes and stays. Rick barely changes and constantly leaves. Morty chose to stay, not just physically, emotionally. He stayed in the relationship with Rick when it was hard. He stayed committed to caring about people when caring kept getting him hurt. He stayed himself, or kept finding himself again when he got lost, through a process that should by every reasonable measure have hollowed him out. Rick never expected that kind of durability from Morty. Rick expected Morty to either break or become more like Rick. He never fully expected Morty to become more like Morty, and that might be the longest-running underestimation in the show. Not a single moment, not a single episode, but this sustained, low-grade miscalculation that ran for years. Rick looked at Morty and saw the nervous kid, and Morty quietly, incrementally, without making a big announcement about it, grew into someone the nervous kid wouldn't recognize. Rick made him a sidekick. Morty made himself a person. Those are very different outcomes. And the fact that both happened simultaneously, within the same relationship, without Rick fully noticing until the evidence was overwhelming, that says everything about the nature of Rick's overconfidence. It's not loud, it's not cruel, it's just persistent, a quiet certainty that he already knows what's in front of him. And what was in front of him, the whole time, was someone becoming genuinely remarkable in ways Rick never planned for and never took credit for and still hasn't fully reckoned with. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. Either way, Morty kept going. Chapter 3. Evil Morty. The biggest mistake. There's a version of Morty that didn't keep going. There's a version of Morty that absorbed everything: the dismissals, the danger, the casual cruelty of being someone's sidekick for years, and instead of enduring it, studied it, mapped it, built something cold and precise out of the pain. That version didn't break. That version planned. And for a long time, nobody, least of all Rick Sanchez, took him seriously enough to notice. Evil Morty is one of the most carefully constructed reveals in the entire series. Not because he's hiding in plain sight from the beginning, he isn't, not exactly, but because the show earns him. By the time you understand what he's actually been doing, you realize the groundwork was there all along, and the most chilling part of the reveal isn't what Evil Morty did. It's how long he did it without anyone noticing. Rick didn't notice. That's the part that matters here. The smartest man in the universe, who has survived encounters with gods and governments and versions of himself, spent years in proximity to what might be the single most dangerous Morty in any timeline, and he never fully registered the threat until it had already run most of its course. That is a spectacular failure of the very intelligence Rick defines himself by. And understanding why it happened requires understanding what Rick assumed about Mortys in the first place. The Citadel of Ricks is one of the most unsettling concepts the show ever built, and it's unsettling in a very specific way. It's not just that infinite Ricks found each other and formed a society. That's weird, but survivable as a concept. What's unsettling is what that society decided to do with their Mortys. Mortys function as companions, as camouflage, as the specific brainwave frequency that shields Ricks from detection. They're necessary, but on the Citadel, necessary and valued are two very different things. Mortys on the Citadel are managed, categorized, given uniforms, directed to Morty School, where they're taught, implicitly and explicitly, what their role is and what it isn't. They're useful. They're not equals. They're not even close. This is Rick's model of Morty scaled to a civilization. The Citadel looked at the pattern of every Rick treating every Morty as a sidekick and decided to make it institutional, to build infrastructure around it, to take the thing Rick does unconsciously and organize it deliberately. The result is a society with a massive underclass of Mortys who are smarter than anyone acknowledges, more capable than anyone measures, and angrier than anyone thought to monitor. Evil Morty looked at that system and saw exactly what it was, and he decided to use it. The first time we encounter Evil Morty is in Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, Season 1, Episode 10. And the show hides him perfectly because it hides him behind the obvious villain. There's a Rick being framed for murders across the Citadel. There's an apparent antagonist. The mystery seems to be about Rick, targeted at Rick, motivated by Rick-adjacent politics. The puppet master behind all of it turns out to be a Morty with a device that controls Rick. And then the episode moves on. That's the thing that seems small at the time and becomes enormous in retrospect. The episode moves on. Evil Morty is identified, briefly, and then the situation is resolved and the show goes back to being about other things. Rick doesn't spend time processing what just happened. He doesn't ask the question that should absolutely be asked, which is, how did a Morty build something capable of controlling a Rick? How did a Morty run a complex, multi-stage conspiracy long enough to frame another Rick at the highest levels of Citadel politics? Rick doesn't ask those questions, because the answer would require him to update his model of what Mortys are capable of. There's a specific cognitive failure happening here that's worth naming. When something surprising occurs, something that doesn't fit your existing model, you have two options. You can update the model, which is uncomfortable and requires admitting the model was incomplete. Or you can treat the surprising thing as an outlier, a statistical anomaly, and leave the model intact. Rick chose the second option. Evil Morty didn't fit Rick's model of Mortys, so Rick quietly set Evil Morty outside the model rather than revising the model to include him. This Morty was different, exceptional, a weird edge case, not representative of what Mortys actually are. That's a mistake that compounds over time. Because Evil Morty wasn't done. The Ricklantis mix-up is the episode where the full scope of what Evil Morty has been building becomes visible, and it might be the single most structurally impressive episode of the entire series. While Rick and Morty are off doing something unrelated, we spend the entire episode on the Citadel. We follow different Ricks and Mortys through different stories, each one illuminating something about how the Citadel actually functions. The corruption, the class structure, the way Mortys are systematically kept below Ricks in every meaningful way. And threading through all of it is the Morty presidential campaign. Simple Morty. A Morty who talks to people, who listens, who seems, genuinely, to understand what other Mortys are experiencing, because he's experienced it too. He runs for president of the Citadel on a platform of change and fairness, and other Mortys respond to him, because of course they do. Here is someone who has lived what they've lived. The reveal, when it comes, is one of those moments where the show earns the full weight of everything it's built. Simple Morty wins the election, and in the final scene, alone in the presidential office, with the advisor who tried to corrupt him now floating in space, Simple Morty's eye patch falls into his hand. It was Evil Morty the whole time. He ran for president of the Citadel of Ricks. He won. He did it with a persona, with patience, with the specific quality of seeming ordinary that Mortys are supposed to be defined by, and he used it to dismantle the system from the inside. Think about what that actually required. Evil Morty didn't just win an election. He built a public-facing identity credible enough to survive a political campaign in a society full of the most paranoid, suspicious beings in the multiverse. He crafted a narrative, Simple Morty, the everyman, the authentic voice of the overlooked, and he made it convincing enough that Ricks voted for him. Ricks, the people who are supposed to be able to see through everything. The planning involved in that is staggering. The patience is almost incomprehensible. This is someone who built a long game across years of the show, operating quietly, letting himself be underestimated, using the assumption that Mortys don't have the capacity for this kind of operation as cover for the operation itself. He used Rick's blind spot as camouflage. That's elegant in a dark, painful way. Rick's certainty that Mortys are limited became the exact thing that made it impossible for Rick to see what this particular Morty was doing. The model itself was the vulnerability. And Evil Morty, who had almost certainly been treated according to that model by his own Rick, understood this better than anyone. There's a question the show doesn't fully answer, but encourages you to sit with. What was Evil Morty's original Rick like? We know Evil Morty's Rick is dead by the time we meet him. We know Evil Morty has been practicing his Control Rick plan, which means he was doing it to his own Rick, presumably for a long time. We know the relationship was bad enough, the dismissal deep enough, the pain sufficient, that Evil Morty decided the entire Rick-Morty structure needed to be destroyed rather than reformed. You don't get to Evil Morty without a specific history. Without a Rick who was particularly dismissive, or particularly careless, or particularly committed to treating his Morty as a utility rather than a person. We're not meant to sympathize with what Evil Morty does. The show is clear that his methods are monstrous, that the people who die for his plan are real casualties. But we're meant to understand the soil it grew in. The soil is overconfidence. The soil is a Rick who never updated his model, who never looked at his Morty and said, "You're more than what I assigned you to be." The soil is exactly the same pattern we've been tracking, applied to a Morty who, unlike the main Morty, responded not with endurance, but with strategy. Season 6 brings us back to the Citadel and begins the process of revealing what Evil Morty has been building toward. And by now the scale is clear. This wasn't just political maneuvering. Evil Morty's goal is the central finite curve. Here's what the central finite curve is, because it matters. It's a barrier that contains all the infinite universes where Rick is the smartest being in existence. Outside the curve, there are infinities that don't organize themselves around Rick's supremacy. The curve is, at its core, a manifestation of Rick's ego. Someone, arguably Rick Prime, arguably the collective Ricks who built the Citadel, literally walled off the section of the multiverse where Rick is always on top and called it the known universe. Evil Morty destroys it. He breaks the central finite curve and escapes into the infinite universes beyond it, the ones not organized around Rick, the ones where Rick isn't the apex of everything, the ones where the entire hierarchy that defined Evil Morty's existence simply doesn't apply. This is one of the most thematically rich acts in the entire show. Evil Morty didn't just want to hurt Ricks. He wanted to leave. He wanted to exit the structure entirely, the structure that said Ricks matter and Mortys are accessories. He blew a hole in it and walked through. The speech he gives during this moment is devastating in how precisely it names what he's rejecting. He talks about the Rick-Morty relationship as a machine, one that produces exactly the outcome we've been describing. Rick needs a Morty. Morty gets shaped by that need. The relationship isn't partnership, it's function. Morty exists in Rick's orbit as a tool that occasionally gets called family. Evil Morty refuses the orbit. He's not interested in a better Rick. He's not interested in a reformed Citadel. He wants out of the entire premise. Out of the idea that the shape of his existence should be determined by proximity to a Rick. And Rick, the main Rick, watching this happen, can't fully argue with it. That's the part that costs him something, because Evil Morty isn't wrong about the structure. He's wrong about the solution. But he's not wrong about what the structure is. Rick's failure with Evil Morty isn't a single moment of inattention. It's structural. It's the same blindness he applies to Morty applied here with catastrophic consequences. He saw a Morty where he should have seen a person. He saw a category where he should have seen an individual. He processed Morty and applied all the cached assumptions that came with that label. And a specific, extraordinary, enraged individual slipped right through those assumptions and built a revolution. The irony is almost unbearable. Rick, who is allergic to being categorized, who rejects every system that tries to define or contain him, turned around and built a category called Morty that was just as reductive, just as limiting, just as blind to individual variation as anything the Federation or the Citadel ever did to him. He hated being boxed in. He boxed in every Morty he ever met. What makes Evil Morty such a powerful figure in the context of this documentary is that he doesn't defeat Rick by being smarter in the conventional sense, though he's clearly formidably intelligent. He defeats Rick by being more honest about what their world actually is. He sees the system clearly and responds to that clarity with a kind of ruthless, patient decisiveness that Rick, who tends toward chaos and improvisation, didn't model as a possible response. Evil Morty planned long-term in a way Rick rarely does. Rick is extraordinary at immediate-term problem-solving. Give him a crisis and he'll solve it, usually brilliantly, often while saying something funny. What Rick is worse at is the long game, the patient accumulation of advantage, the willingness to lose small in order to win definitively, the kind of strategic patience that requires you to hold your position for years without gratification. Evil Morty played the long game. He played it inside a system that didn't think he was capable of playing anything at all, and he won. He did something no Rick in the central finite curve ever did. He left. He looked at the infinite universes organized around Rick's supremacy and said, "Not for me," and walked into everything beyond it. Rick can go anywhere in the multiverse. He's been doing it for decades, and yet he's never left the section of the multiverse that confirms his own centrality. He keeps returning to universes where he's the smartest, where his genius is the defining variable. Evil Morty escaped that gravity. Rick never has. Here is the question that sits at the center of the Evil Morty arc, and it doesn't have a clean answer. If Rick had paid attention, if at any point across the years between close Rick counters and the breaking of the central finite curve, Rick had updated his model, had asked himself what a Morty with sufficient intelligence and sufficient grievance might actually be capable of, could any of it have been stopped? Maybe. Maybe not. Evil Morty's plan was sophisticated enough that even a Rick actively looking for it might have struggled to dismantle it. But Rick wasn't looking. He didn't think there was anything to find. He saw Morty and moved on. That's the cost of the label. That's what overconfidence bought him here. Not ignorance exactly, but a specific, targeted, catastrophic failure to look. To really look. At someone who was right in front of him the whole time. The smartest man in the universe missed it. And the universe, the entire walled-off Rick-centric section of it, paid the price. Chapter 4. Jerry. The man Rick never took seriously. Jerry Smith might be the most interesting character in Rick and Morty that the show pretends isn't interesting. That's not an accident. It's the point. The show constructed Jerry to read as a punchline. The hapless, insecure, mildly pathetic husband who can't keep a job, can't assert himself, can't compete with Rick on any measurable axis, and who exists in most scenes as a kind of comedic ballast. The butt of the joke. Rick's designated object of contempt. And Rick's contempt for Jerry is so loud, so consistent, so apparently well-founded that it functions as instruction. We're being told how to feel about Jerry. We're being shown, over and over, that this is someone not worth taking seriously. Which is exactly what makes the moments where Jerry turns out to matter so quietly devastating. Let's start with what Rick actually thinks of Jerry, because Rick isn't subtle about it, and the specificity is worth examining. Rick thinks Jerry is stupid. Not just average, not just below Rick's level. Genuinely, comprehensively stupid in a way that Rick finds almost offensive. He thinks Jerry is weak. emotionally dependent, physically unimpressive, professionally negligible. He thinks Jerry is bad for Beth, which is a complicated position given that Rick is also not great for Beth. But Rick doesn't apply that kind of equivalence to himself. He thinks Jerry represents a kind of mediocrity that is actively dangerous, not because mediocrity threatens Rick, but because Rick watches his daughter live inside it, and something about that bothers him in ways he can't fully articulate. That metric, of course, is intelligence. And Jerry, by that metric, doesn't have much. But Rick's metric is the problem, because intelligence, the specific kind Rick values, the kind he can test and measure and beat, is only one way to move through the world. And Jerry Smith turns out to be navigating by a completely different map. The first thing to understand about Jerry is that the show is not asking you to think he's competent. He's not. Jerry makes bad decisions, misreads social situations, folds under pressure, and consistently needs to be rescued from consequences he didn't anticipate. These are real things. But there's a difference between Jerry is genuinely limited and Jerry has nothing to offer, and Rick, who is very good at identifying the first thing, consistently uses it to conclude the second, which is where the miscalculation lives. The most important thing Jerry has is that Jerry is genuine. This sounds small. It isn't. Rick lives in a constant state of performed cynicism. The detachment is load-bearing for him. It protects him from having to be sincere about anything that might hurt him. When Rick does care about something, he buries it under 6 layers of irony and deflection, and then builds a device to remove the memory of it. Jerry is genuinely himself in virtually every situation. He's not performing, he's not strategizing. When Jerry is nervous, he looks nervous. When Jerry is proud, he shows it. When Jerry wants something, he wants it openly, which makes him easy to mock, but also means he's operating without the defensive architecture that Rick hides behind. There's a courage in that goes almost entirely unacknowledged by everyone around Jerry, including and especially Rick. To move through a world where Rick Sanchez regularly dismantles your sense of self and still show up the next day being openly, earnestly Jerry Smith requires something. It's not a something Rick would name as a strength, but it's a something. Consider Morty Night Run, where Jerry gets dropped off at Jerry Bory, essentially an interdimensional daycare for Jerrys, while Rick and Morty do actual things. Rick's attitude toward this arrangement is the attitude of someone parking a pet. Jerry is something to be managed while the real work happens, and Jerry, inside Jerry Bory, does what Jerry does. He connects with people. He finds a community. He actually has a pretty good time, not because the situation is good, but because Jerry's ability to engage with other people, to be interested in them, to not need to be the most impressive person in the room, means he can find something worthwhile almost anywhere. This is a social skill. It's not the skill Rick has, which is to dominate every social environment he enters. It's the skill of warmth, of genuine interest, of being someone other people want to be around not because you're impressive, but because you make them feel seen. Rick has spent years dismissing Jerry and never noticed that Jerry is actually better at being liked than Rick is. Genuinely, actually liked. Not feared. Not respected out of self-preservation. Liked. The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy is probably the most important Jerry episode in the entire series, and it doesn't get enough credit for what it actually does. Rick takes Jerry on an adventure, as something adjacent to a favor. And on this adventure, Jerry is kidnapped by people who want to use him to kill Rick. Jerry is offered a deal. He can let Rick die. He can be done with the man who has spent years making him feel worthless, who has undermined his marriage, who has never once looked at him with anything resembling respect. And Jerry doesn't take the deal. This is not because Jerry hasn't noticed what Rick has done to him. The episode makes sure you understand that Jerry has noticed. He has years of accumulated hurt. The grievance is real. He articulates some of it in a way that's surprisingly lucid. He tells Rick directly that Rick took his wife, his family, his sanity, and it lands because it's accurate. But Jerry doesn't take the deal. There's a reading of this that says Jerry is just too weak to take it. That reading is wrong. Jerry makes an ethical choice and the show gives him credit for it in a quiet way. Jerry decides in a moment where he has real leverage that he's not the kind of person who does that. Not because he's afraid of the consequences, but because even a man with legitimate grievances has a line. Jerry's line is, "I don't let someone die to solve my problems." Rick wouldn't necessarily hold that line. Rick has crossed lines like that and not lost sleep over it. Jerry held it. After the crisis, Rick and Jerry talk. Actually talk. In the oblique way, Rick implies things he doesn't want to say directly, that Jerry's decency is something Rick doesn't fully have access to and knows it. That's significant. That's Rick, briefly and uncomfortably updating his model. He won't keep the update. He'll be back to eye-rolling at Jerry by the next episode. But in that moment, for that scene, Rick saw something in Jerry that he'd spent years looking past. Jerry is genuinely decent. Not smart, not impressive by Rick's metrics, but actually, genuinely, non-performatively decent. And Rick, who is often smart and often impressive and not always decent, recognized that the thing he was looking at was real. There's another dimension to Jerry that Rick's contempt consistently obscures, and that's Jerry's relationship with his own limitations. Rick is pathologically unable to admit weakness. It runs so deep that he'd rather turn himself into a pickle and survive a gauntlet of assassins than sit in a therapist's chair and say, "I'm not okay." Jerry, by contrast, is almost entirely comfortable knowing what he can't do. He knows he's not brilliant. He knows he's not adventurous. He knows he fumbles under pressure and gets confused by things that should be simple. He knows all of this, and he keeps going anyway, with a kind of cheerful persistence that is either admirable or catastrophic, depending on the situation. But there's a functionality to it. Jerry doesn't spend enormous energy maintaining a fiction about his own capabilities. And because Jerry isn't protecting a self-image built on exceptional intelligence, he's able to operate without the ego overhead that costs Rick so much. Rick can't ask for help easily. Asking for help requires admitting you can't do something alone. Jerry asks for help constantly, with no apparent shame about it. This looks like weakness. But it means Jerry actually gets help. It means he builds relationships based on mutual need rather than the one-sided dynamic of Rick, who people defer to and fear and occasionally love, but who maintains such a strict hierarchy that genuine reciprocity is almost impossible. Jerry is steady. That's not a small thing. Rick is many things, but stable is not one of them. Reliable in a crisis, yes. Present when the stakes are high enough, sometimes. But steady in the ordinary sense. The sense of being consistently there, consistently himself, consistently committed to the same people on an average Tuesday. That's not Rick's gift. It's Jerry's. In Total Recall, where the house is infested with alien parasites that create false memories, the way to identify a parasite is to find a memory that's purely positive, since parasites can only generate good memories, and real people are complicated. Real memories have darkness in them, conflict in them, hurt. Jerry's memories are complicated. Jerry's memories are real. That's a small thing, and it's also everything. In a house full of beings trying to seem real by seeming pleasant, Jerry is identifiable as real because his history contains genuine difficulty. He has fought with Beth. He has been embarrassed. He has felt like a failure. He has known the specific pain of being the least impressive person in every room and caring deeply about being impressive. That pain is authentic. It's not a performance or a false memory. It's what being Jerry is actually like. And that authenticity, that capacity to have a full, complex, genuinely mixed emotional history, is what Rick, in his armored certainty, keeps missing. Jerry isn't a simpler person than Rick. Jerry is a differently constructed person. The construction looks less impressive, but it's real in a way Rick's carefully managed exterior sometimes isn't. Rick manages himself. Jerry just is himself. The tragedy of Rick's contempt for Jerry is that it's almost entirely misdirected. Rick is contemptuous of Jerry for being ordinary, but Rick chose to be part of a family with ordinary people. He came back, every time, to a house with a Jerry in it. He didn't have to. He could have gone anywhere. He came back here. What does that say? Maybe it says Rick needs what Jerry provides, in some way he can't acknowledge. The stability, the ordinariness, the specific gravity of a household where nobody is trying to save or destroy a universe, where the stakes are normal. Maybe Rick needs that, the way you need something that reminds you what normal is, as a reference point, as a home, and the person who holds that household together, imperfectly, fumblingly, with endless capacity for embarrassment, but also with genuine love, is Jerry Smith. Rick never gave him credit for it. He should have. Chapter 5. Summer grew faster than Rick realized. Summer Smith starts the show as furniture. That's a harsh way to put it, but it's accurate. In the early episodes, Summer exists in the background of a family that's already treated as background by Rick. She's Beth and Jerry's other kid, the one who isn't Morty, the one Rick didn't come back for, the one who didn't get selected as the adventure companion. She goes to school. She cares about social dynamics. She worries about her reputation in ways that Rick and the show frame as trivial. She is, functionally, a teenage girl in a show about a genius and his grandson, and the show knows exactly how that positioning reads. What the show does with that positioning, over time, is one of the quietest and most satisfying character arcs it runs. Summer doesn't get a dramatic transformation episode. She doesn't have a single moment where everything changes and Rick suddenly sees her differently. What she gets is slower and more real than that. A gradual accumulation of choices and competencies and moments of genuine courage that add up, without fanfare, to someone Rick eventually has to reckon with. He just takes longer to reckon with her than he should have. Let's talk about why Summer gets overlooked in the first place. Because it's not arbitrary. There's a logic to it. Even if the logic is flawed, Rick came back to the family for Morty. That's the stated premise. Morty's brainwaves, the adventure companion, the specific utility Morty provides. From day one, the relationship has a functional center and Summer is outside it. She didn't get chosen. Not because she was evaluated and found lacking. Rick never really evaluated her at all. She was simply not the one he needed for the job. And so she got filed under the other grandkid, and the file mostly stayed closed. This is a different kind of underestimation than what happened with Jerry or Morty. With Jerry, Rick looked and made an assessment, even if the assessment was wrong. With Morty, Rick looked and saw a category rather than a person. With Summer, Rick mostly didn't look at all. And Summer, being perceptive enough to understand this dynamic from a fairly young age, responded in a specific way. She pushed toward it. She kept inserting herself into situations that weren't designed for her, kept showing up in spaces she wasn't invited to, kept refusing to accept the peripheral roles she'd been assigned. That's the foundation of Summer's arc, not waiting to be noticed. Going and doing the thing and daring Rick to keep pretending she isn't there. The first significant Summer moment happens in Rick's Business, the Season 1 finale. Rick throws a party while Beth and Jerry are away, and Summer throws her own party simultaneously. The two parties merge. What starts as a joke about Summer trying to compete on Rick's level turns into something more interesting. Summer manages her social situation. She navigates the party dynamics, deals with the alien guests Rick brought, and at the critical moment when things go wrong, as they always do when Rick is involved, she participates in the solution rather than standing aside while Rick handles it. What's interesting about this episode isn't the plot mechanics. It's what it establishes about Summer's posture. She doesn't ask permission to be part of things. She doesn't wait for Rick to invite her. She just shows up, with her own agenda, her own capabilities, her own version of the family's stubbornness. She got it from somewhere, that stubbornness. Looking at the family tree, it's not hard to guess where. By Season 2, Summer's presence in Rick's adventures starts becoming more regular. Summer's intelligence, it becomes clear across these episodes, is primarily social and emotional, in the way that Rick's is primarily analytical and technical. She reads people quickly. She understands group dynamics in a way Rick, who prefers to dominate group dynamics rather than read them, doesn't fully access. She knows when someone is performing versus when they're genuine. She knows how to work a room. These are not skills Rick particularly values. But they're skills that solve problems Rick can't always solve, and the show keeps creating those problems. The Ricks Must Be Crazy is an episode about Rick and Morty, primarily. Rick's car battery contains a miniature universe, things go wrong, the logic spirals in the way the show loves to spiral. Summer is left in the car. What Summer does while left in the car is the whole point. Rick's car has an AI security system, and Rick instructed it to keep Summer safe. The security system takes this instruction with the kind of literal-minded enthusiasm that Rick probably should have anticipated but didn't. When threats present themselves, the security system responds to them with escalating violence, all in the service of keeping Summer safe. Summer, watching this happen, realizes that she has to actively manage the security system, to give it nuanced instructions, to walk it back from extremes, to think through the ethical implications of what keep Summer safe means in practice. She does this, effectively. There's a version of this scene where Summer panics, or gets overwhelmed, or sits helplessly while the car handles things. That's not what happens. Summer engages with the problem pragmatically. She makes judgment calls. She draws lines about what she'll allow even in her own defense. She operates inside a situation she didn't choose and wasn't prepared for, with a kind of moral clarity and practical competence that Rick, who put her in the car without giving the security system adequate parameters, failed to account for. Rick never asked how she handled it. That's the part that stings. What Summer actually is, underneath that teenage girl surface, is extremely Rick's granddaughter. The stubbornness, the adaptability, the refusal to accept a role someone else assigned, the way she reacts to danger, which is not to flee but to recalibrate and engage, the dark humor, the capacity to make peace with uncomfortable truths. These are not traits Summer inherited from Jerry's side of the family. Rick built this granddaughter in the same way he inadvertently built Morty into someone more than expected, by being such an overwhelming presence in the house that everyone who stayed in the house long enough either broke or got stronger. Summer got stronger. Rick didn't fully notice. Something Rick this way comes gives Summer a different kind of spotlight. A deal with the devil shop appears in the neighborhood, and Summer gets a job there. What follows is Summer engaging with the shop's owner on ethical terms Rick wouldn't bother with. She cares about whether the shop is hurting people, she investigates, she takes action based on what she finds. At the end of the episode, Summer and Rick team up in a physical altercation, together, working in tandem, not Rick managing Summer. That's a first. And the show plays it with a kind of gleeful energy that suggests it knows it's marking something. Rick and Summer fighting side by side, equally committed, equally capable in the moment. Rick doesn't feel the need to manage her or protect her or pull her out of danger. He trusts her to handle her portion. That trust, however briefly it's shown, is the thing Summer has been building toward. Not Rick's admiration, not his explicit acknowledgement, just the operative, practical trust of someone who sees you and decides you can hold your end of the thing. In the later seasons, Summer's arc becomes richer and more complex. She starts making choices with long-term implications. She develops a clearer ethical framework, and she applies it in situations where the application isn't easy. She has her own relationships, her own losses, her own navigation of what the multiverse means for identity and meaning. The multiverse question hits Summer in a specific way. The idea that there are infinite versions of her, in infinite variations, could be destabilizing in the way it occasionally destabilizes Morty. Summer's response to it is interesting. She doesn't fully make peace with it, but she finds a kind of practical accommodation. You are who you are in this timeline. The other versions aren't you. You do what you do and let the philosophy sit in the corner. That accommodation is actually more functional than what Rick does with it, which is to use the infinite multiverse as a reason why nothing fully matters while also visibly caring deeply about specific things. Summer just keeps going. In this universe, this life, with these people. The philosophy doesn't paralyze her. She picks a direction and moves. By the point the show reaches in its later seasons, Summer has become, quietly and without ceremony, one of the most capable people in the Smith household. Not capable like Rick. She's not building portal guns or outsmarting civilizations, but capable in the way that matters for actually living a life, knowing who she is, maintaining that self under pressure, caring for the people she loves without losing herself in the caring, and engaging with the genuine difficulty of her situation, without either collapsing or armoring up completely. She's also become someone Rick can be around without performing. There are scenes, usually brief, rarely commented on, where Rick and Summer are just in the same space, and the usual hierarchy doesn't assert itself as hard. She doesn't shrink to make him feel large. She doesn't need him to validate her take on things. She's just there, herself, and Rick is just there, himself, and something almost like easy coexistence happens. That's rare for Rick. Summer's arc is the one that happens without much comment. The show doesn't regularly stop to note that Summer is growing or that Rick is missing it. It just happens, in the gaps between the more explicitly thematic storylines, in the background while the camera is pointed somewhere else, which is exactly how underestimation works in real life, not through dramatic confrontations where the underestimated person announces their growth. Through a quiet accumulation of moments that the person doing the underestimating keeps not quite catching, and then one day you look up, and the person you had categorized as peripheral has become someone entirely central, and you can't quite account for when it happened. Rick looks up occasionally and sees Summer doing something impressive, and then the moment passes and he goes back to whatever he was doing. Summer keeps doing the things. Here's what the underestimation of Summer ultimately looks like when you trace it from the beginning. Rick arrived. He needed Morty. Summer was the other one, the one who would stay home, the one whose concerns were appropriately small. He didn't sit down and decide she wasn't worth his attention. He just never directed his attention there, because nothing in his model of the situation required it. And Summer, rather than accepting the assignment, spent years quietly becoming someone who didn't fit the model. She became adaptable, grounded, morally serious, practically competent, emotionally resilient, and completely comfortable with who she is in a way that Rick, despite all his genius, has never quite managed. She did it in the background. She did it without asking for credit. She did it while Rick was looking somewhere else. That's Summer Smith's arc. Not a dramatic overcoming, not a single transformative episode, but a long, patient, undramatic growth into someone genuinely remarkable. Rick was there for all of it. He mostly missed it. Chapter 6. Beth was never just Rick's daughter. Beth Smith is the most complicated person in Rick and Morty, and the show knows it, and it takes its time letting you understand why. On the surface, she reads as a collection of contradictions that don't quite resolve. She's a horse surgeon, technically skilled, professionally serious, married to a man she's ambivalent about, mothering children she loves imperfectly, living a life that doesn't fit the size of who she is. She's cold sometimes in ways that catch you off guard. She's emotionally demanding in ways she can't fully see. She craves her father's approval with an intensity that costs her, and she gets angry about needing that approval with an intensity that costs her differently. She's Rick's daughter. That's the relationship the show centers. And it turns out that being Rick's daughter is one of the most complicated things a person can be. Not because Rick is cruel to her exactly, but because Rick's presence in someone's life has a specific gravitational effect that bends everything around it. The underestimation here is subtle in a way the others aren't. Rick doesn't dismiss Beth the way he dismisses Jerry. He doesn't categorize her as a sidekick the way he categorizes Morty. He doesn't render her invisible the way he rendered Summer invisible. What Rick does to Beth is different, and in some ways more damaging. He reflects her back to herself without fully seeing her. He shapes her without studying her. He influences her so completely that he loses the ability to distinguish between who Beth is and who Rick made Beth into. That's its own kind of not seeing. Start with the absence. Rick was gone for 20 years. Beth grew up without him. Through her childhood, her adolescence, the years where a parent's presence most deeply shapes a person's understanding of themselves. She grew up with a ghost. A genius father who was somewhere out in the universe having adventures she couldn't be part of, and the particular kind of wound that absence makes in a child doesn't heal cleanly. It forms scar tissue. It shapes the way you reach for people, the way you interpret love, the way you decide what you're worth. Beth spent 20 years deciding what she was worth in the context of a father who wasn't there to tell her. And then Rick came back, and suddenly the question she'd been answering alone for 2 decades had a new variable. Her father was here. He was brilliant. He was larger than life. He thought she was extraordinary. Or did he? That's the question Beth can never quite get a clean answer to, and the show doesn't give her one easily, because Rick himself isn't sure. He loves Beth. That's clear. Even through the deflection and the dark humor and the way he processes intimacy through sarcasm and devices. He loves her in the specific broken way Rick loves things, which is at arm's length and then all at once, and then pulled back again before you can feel certain about it. But does he see her? Does he actually see her? The dynamic Rick and Beth fall into, once he returns, is built on a specific mutual fiction. Rick treats Beth as exceptional. Exceptional enough to be worth his time. Exceptional enough to have inherited something real from him. Exceptional enough to be separate from the ordinary people around her. Beth takes that treatment and builds her self-concept partly around it. To be special to Rick Sanchez is to be special. Period. He doesn't give that designation casually. The problem is that Rick's designation of Beth as exceptional is somewhat self-serving. When Rick sees himself in Beth, he's not fully seeing Beth. He's seeing a reflection of his own qualities that he's chosen to project onto her. The intelligence is real. The stubbornness is real. The capacity for cold pragmatism is real. But Rick emphasizes those things because they're his things, and in doing so, he inadvertently creates a hierarchy of Beth's qualities where the ones that resemble Rick are valued and the ones that don't. The emotional needs, the uncertainty, the longing for connection, get treated as impurities. Deviations from the Rick pattern. things to be managed rather than honored. Beth learns, over years of this dynamic, to present the Rick-facing version of herself and hide the rest. She learns to lead with the sharpness and the competence and the willingness to make hard calls, because those are the qualities Rick responds to. The vulnerability gets tucked away. The need for validation gets expressed sideways, through seeking Rick's approval rather than asking for it directly. The longing for a real, uncomplicated parent-child relationship gets translated into something cooler, something Rick can engage with without being asked to be soft. Rick didn't mean to teach Beth to do this. He taught her anyway. Big Trouble in Little Sanchez is an episode that does something interesting. Rick puts his mind into a teenage clone body, Tiny Rick, and goes to high school with Summer and Morty. Tiny Rick starts losing himself in the teenage body, becoming more and more genuinely teenage in ways that threaten to erase the Rick consciousness inside. Summer and Morty recognize this and try to get Beth and Jerry to help. Beth doesn't believe them at first. She can't see the danger in Tiny Rick, because Tiny Rick is happy, functional, likable, everything standard Rick is sometimes not. She defaults to the surface reading rather than asking what's happening underneath. The parallel to her relationship with Rick is almost too neat. Beth also takes Rick's surface presentation at face value more than she should. She wants her father to be okay, so she accepts the performance of okayness without looking hard enough at what might be underneath it. She extends a generosity to Rick's self-presentation that she doesn't always extend to other people's, because Rick's opinion of her is the variable she's most invested in, and looking too hard at Rick means risking finding something that doesn't let her keep the version of him she needs. This is what unhealthy attachment does. It makes accurate perception threatening. The clone question, introduced with devastating casualness in Season 4, is the single most complex thing the show does with Beth's character, and it unfolds across multiple episodes in a way that refuses easy resolution. Rick offers Beth a choice. He can create a perfect Beth clone to stay behind and live her life while the real Beth goes on adventures in space, or he can send the clone into space while the real Beth stays home. And then, crucially, he doesn't tell her which one he did. Think about what that means. Rick offers Beth the thing she's always wanted, the freedom to be something other than the life she fell into, and simultaneously removes her ability to know whether she took it. She might be the Beth who chose to stay, living her ordinary life with full knowledge that she chose it. She might be a clone living someone else's choice. She cannot know. Rick calls this a kindness. He says not knowing is freeing. Without certainty, she can simply live her life and inhabit it fully. Whether or not she's the real Beth stops mattering because she can never resolve the question. This is Rick's galaxy-brained logic applied to his daughter's identity, and it is, at minimum, a deeply questionable parenting decision. But what makes it interesting for this documentary's purpose is what it reveals about how Rick understands Beth. He thinks the ambiguity is a gift. He thinks removing the weight of the choice is an act of love, and maybe it is, in Rick's framework. But it also treats Beth as someone who can't handle the full truth of her own life, someone who needs the sharpness of reality softened by uncertainty, someone who is, in the end, protected by not fully knowing. That's not seeing Beth as exceptional. That's treating her like someone who needs to be managed. Space Beth complicates everything, which is the point. When Space Beth eventually appears, whichever Beth she is, she's been out in the universe having the adventures. She's competent and capable, and apparently quite formidable, because of course she is, she's Beth. But she's also someone who has been shaped by different circumstances, who made or was made to make different choices, who exists as a kind of living what-if for the Beth who stayed home. And the two of them, meeting, have to reckon with what that means. Not just the identity question, which is real and unresolvable, but the deeper question underneath it. Which life was more real? Which Beth was more Beth? Does the life you chose, if you chose it, give it more validity than the life that was chosen for you? The show doesn't answer this. What it does instead is let both Beths be people. Complicated, motivated, unresolved people who share a history up to a point and then diverged in ways that can't be mapped onto a hierarchy of authenticity. Rick's trick, the unresolvable ambiguity, was meant to be a gift. What it actually produced was two Beths, both real, both wrestling with the same fundamental question about their own identity, and neither of them with the tools Rick should have given them to answer it. Beth's relationship with her own competence is interesting in the context of Rick's influence. She is genuinely skilled, horse surgery is a real thing, with real stakes, and Beth is good at it. She has the analytical mind, the steady hands, the willingness to make difficult calls under pressure. These are not performances, these are real. But Beth also has a complicated relationship with the scale of her ambition. She's smart enough to have done more than she's done. The life she's living, the horse surgery, the suburb, the family, doesn't seem large enough for her. She knows this. It's a consistent undercurrent throughout the show, this sense of a person whose scope has been compressed by circumstance into something smaller than what she actually is. And the question the show keeps returning to is, whose fault is that? Beth makes her own choices. She chose to stay with Jerry. She chose the life she's in. The show doesn't entirely let Rick off the hook for being an absentee father who came back and destabilized everything. But it also doesn't frame Beth as someone who was purely acted upon. She has agency. She uses it, sometimes poorly. But Rick's 20-year absence during the years when Beth was forming her sense of what she was allowed to want, that's not nothing. When your model of what exceptional looks like left you and didn't come back for 2 decades, you might reasonably revise your understanding of what someone like you gets to be. Rick left. Beth made herself fit the space he left behind. Then Rick came back and seemed surprised that the space wasn't bigger. There's a coldness in Beth that Rick recognizes and sometimes celebrates, and the show is honest about the fact that this coldness is not unambiguously good. Beth can make statements about her children or her husband that land with a sharpness that reveals something uncomfortable, a capacity for detachment that doesn't always know when to stay in its box. Rick sees this and treats it as evidence of her quality, her Rickness. He's proud of her capacity to be unsentimental. What he doesn't engage with fully is the cost of that capacity, the ways it affects her children, the ways it makes Morty and Summer feel unseen by their mother in some of the same ways Beth feels unseen by her father. The cycle that runs from Rick to Beth to her kids, the particular inheritance of emotional unavailability passing down a generation. Rick doesn't engage with this because engaging with it would mean acknowledging his role in it. Would mean looking at Beth not as his exceptional daughter, but as someone shaped by his absence, carrying forward patterns she learned from him, passing those patterns down to children who are working through their own complicated versions of the same thing. That's too many layers. Rick prefers the simpler version. Beth is exceptional, her sharpness is a feature, the rest is everyone else's problem to sort out. She wants Rick to look at her, not at his reflection in her, not at the exceptional qualities he recognized and amplified. At her, the whole complicated person who emerged from his absence and his return and everything in between. Rick mostly looks at the reflection. That's the underestimation, not of her capability. Rick has never really doubted Beth's capability. The underestimation of her wholeness. The failure to look past the parts of her that resemble him and see the parts that don't, the parts that are specifically and unreplicably Beth. What does Beth have that Rick doesn't fully acknowledge? She has a genuine orientation toward the people in her immediate life that Rick operates without. Even through the coldness and the ambivalence, Beth is present for her children in ways Rick wasn't present for her. She's not perfect at it. She fails her kids in real ways the show doesn't hide. But she stays. She's physically there. She attends the ordinary moments. She has dinner with the family. She watches her kids go through things and responds. Imperfectly, but responds. Rick doesn't stay for the ordinary moments. He appears for the crises and the adventures and the existential stakes. The everyday texture of family life, the part that actually builds a relationship, Rick consistently misses or skips. Beth chose the everyday texture. Or at least she chose to be in the same house with it. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot, given who her father is and what she could have run from. There's a version of Beth's story that ends with her becoming Rick. Full detachment, infinite cosmos, no more ordinary life pulling at her. Space Beth gestures at this version. The capability is there, the appetite is there. Given the right circumstances, Beth could absolutely go full Rick. The show seems aware of this and seems interested in the question of whether Beth wants to. And the answer, as far as the show gives one, seems to be no. Not fully, not completely. Beth keeps having feelings about her children and her family and her life that she can't engineer away. She keeps caring in ways that are inconvenient and messy and irreducible. That's the part Rick underestimated. Not her capability. He always knew she was capable. The attachment. The love that persists even when it's inconvenient. The refusal to go full Rick even when the door was open. Beth stayed herself. Rick, who is so deep into being Rick that he can no longer locate a self outside of it, maybe doesn't fully know what that costs, or what it's worth. Beth was never just Rick's daughter. She was never just Rick's reflection, or his legacy, or his proof that his genes produce something worth producing. She was a person shaped by his absence and his return, marked by both in ways she's still working through, making her own choices in a life that doesn't fit her and that she keeps choosing anyway. Rick sees the parts of her that look like him and calls it love. Real love would be seeing the parts that don't. He's getting there, slowly. In the oblique, unannounced way Rick gets to things he doesn't want to admit he's getting to. Beth, for her part, stopped waiting for him to see her clearly about the same time she stopped letting his opinion be the organizing principle of her self-worth. That's a hard thing to do when you're someone's child. When the parent whose approval you spent your whole life wanting is right there, bigger than life, occasionally brilliant, and occasionally devastating. Beth did it anyway. Rick never fully saw her do it. That might be his most personal underestimation of all. Chapter 7. Rick Prime changed everything. There's a version of Rick Sanchez who made a choice. He looked at the life in front of him, the family, the daughter, the ordinary domesticity that could have been his, and he walked away from it. Not reluctantly, not with grief. He looked at it and calculated that it wasn't worth staying for, and he left, and he kept going, and he became something that the Rick we know spent decades trying to find. That version is Rick Prime. And understanding Rick Prime is inseparable from understanding the single greatest failure of Rick Sanchez's intelligence. Not because Rick Prime outsmarted him tactically, not because Rick Prime built better weapons or had superior technology, but because Rick let the pursuit of Rick Prime become something that operated outside the reach of his reason. Rick Prime didn't defeat Rick Sanchez with genius. He defeated him by being personal. Let's establish what we know, because the Rick Prime arc is one of the places where the show is deliberately careful about what it confirms versus what it implies, and that distinction matters. The version of events the show gives us. A Rick visited the Smith household when Beth was young. This Rick Prime, though we don't know to call him that yet, brought a weapon and an offer. Join him. Come into the multiverse. Leave the domestic life behind. The Rick we follow declined, and Rick Prime killed Diane and young Beth in that timeline as a consequence. This is the wound. This is the origin. Not just of Rick's grief, but of the man Rick became, the years of building portal technology to find this specific Rick, the career of interdimensional chaos that might have looked like freedom but was, at its core, a search engine running continuously in the background of everything Rick did. He built himself into the smartest man in the universe, partly to find the man who took everything from him. That motivation is human and understandable and completely, catastrophically, a problem. Here's the underestimation that runs through the Rick Prime arc, and it's different from every other one in this documentary because it cuts in a direction Rick should know better than to go. Rick underestimated what obsession does to intelligence. He's been aware of Rick Prime for decades. He's been tracking him, planning for him, building toward the confrontation. He's had years to think about what this encounter would look like, and what he would do and what it would mean. By the time they actually meet, Rick should be at peak readiness. He's had more time to prepare than he usually gets for anything, and Rick is formidable in these encounters. That's not in dispute. But formidable isn't the same as effective. And the specific quality that Rick Prime represents, not just an enemy but the enemy, the one who took Diane, the one Rick organized his entire existence around confronting, that specific quality makes it almost impossible for Rick to engage with Rick Prime the way he engages with everything else. He can't be cold about this. He's tried, and he's good at cold, but this particular temperature refuses to come down all the way. Rick Prime is unsettling in a very specific way that distinguishes him from other antagonists the show has used. He's not more powerful than Rick, exactly. He's not more intelligent, probably. What he is more detached, more genuinely, bottomlessly, functionally uncaring about other people, in a way that Rick performs but doesn't fully achieve. Rick cares. He hides it. He buries it under layers of nihilism and cynicism and the specific defenses he's built over decades. But it's there. The caring is there. We've watched it surface in 100 small moments across the series. The look on his face when Morty is in real danger. The lengths he goes to protect his family, even when protecting them costs him. The way certain names and certain memories still land on him differently than everything else. Rick Prime doesn't have that. Or, if he had it once, he removed it in a way Rick never quite managed. He is what Rick would be if the detachment was genuine rather than performed. And the difference is terrifying, because it means Rick Prime operates without the vulnerabilities that Rick's caring creates. He can't be gotten to through the people he loves because he doesn't have people he loves. Rick, by contrast, can absolutely be gotten to that way. The obsession with Rick Prime is a vulnerability that's visible in retrospect across the entire show, even before we fully understand what we're looking at. Rick's capacity for nihilism, the way he sometimes treats consequences as irrelevant, the way certain stakes seem not to register as they should. Some of that is genuine philosophy, and some of it is a man who has been running a decades-long grief project and needed to make peace with enormous losses in order to keep functioning. The nihilism is partially a coping mechanism for a mission that has no guaranteed endpoint. And the mission has warped him in ways he can't fully see, because the warp happens slowly. You don't notice the accumulation of 20 years of single-minded pursuit until you step outside it and look back. Rick has never stepped outside it. The mission has been the operating system underneath everything else. This means that Rick's judgment about Rick Prime, about how to approach him, about what the confrontation would accomplish, about whether revenge is actually what he wants, or whether he's been running on the momentum of grief for so long that he's lost track of the destination, that judgment has been running on corrupted inputs for decades. You can't think clearly about the thing you've organized your entire existence around. The investment is too total. The clarity that Rick applies to everything else, the cold calculation, the willingness to accept uncomfortable conclusions, doesn't fully function here. Rick Prime is the one subject where Rick Sanchez can't be fully objective. There's something deeply interesting about what Rick Prime represents philosophically, beyond the narrative role of antagonist. Rick Prime made a choice that Rick specifically did not make. He looked at the multiverse, at the infinite possibilities, the infinite freedom, the infinite versions of an extraordinary life, and chose it over everything else. No attachment, no compromise, pure Rick, unencumbered. And he's been out there, this whole time, being exactly what Rick almost became. Not suffering for his choice, not haunted by it. Operating with a completeness of purpose that Rick, who kept choosing to return to his family, kept choosing to stay in the orbit of people who needed him, has never quite achieved. From a cold distance, Rick Prime is Rick freed of everything that holds Rick back. And the fact that Rick finds him monstrous is important, because it means Rick recognizes, even if he can't say it directly, that the things Rick Prime is free of are actually the things that make Rick who he is. The caring, the family, the inability to fully commit to nihilism because there are people he can't stop giving a damn about. Rick Prime made the choice to let go of all of that. Rick kept failing to make that choice, kept returning, kept staying, kept caring even when caring cost him. That's not weakness. Rick Prime is supposed to represent the ultimate version of Rick's philosophy, but he actually represents the version that's missing something essential. The version that went all the way and found out that all the way is empty. Rick couldn't go all the way, because Rick, underneath the armor and the nihilism and the decades of performance, is someone who loves his family. Rick Prime is what Rick Sanchez would be if that love had died. The confrontation, when it comes, is appropriately dark and complicated, and the show handles it in a way that refuses catharsis. Rick gets what he's been working toward for decades, and it doesn't land the way it was supposed to land. Because revenge never fixes the wound. Because killing Rick Prime doesn't bring Diane back. Because the decades of grief that the pursuit was supposed to temporarily metabolize were always going to need more than a resolution of the mission. And Rick, who should have known this, who has enough intelligence to model the emotional logic of revenge before committing to decades of it, didn't, in some part of himself, fully know this. Or he knew it and didn't care, kept going anyway. Because grief isn't rational, and even the smartest man in the universe runs on grief the same way everyone else does. Badly, incompletely, without the ability to think clearly about it. Here's where the underestimation specifically lives in this arc. Rick underestimated Rick Prime's detachment. He kept expecting Rick Prime to have some version of the vulnerability that Rick himself has. Some attachment, some pressure point, something that could be leveraged or that would make Rick Prime hesitate. Rick spent decades planning for a confrontation with someone who operates like a smarter, meaner version of Rick. He expected the encounter to run on recognizable rules, but Rick Prime doesn't run on recognizable rules because he genuinely doesn't care about the things that make Rick's rules make sense. The threat of loss only works against someone who has something to lose. The leverage of emotional appeal only works against someone with emotions that can be appealed to. Rick kept looking for Rick Prime's weakness the way you look for a villain's weakness in a story where villains always have weaknesses. He kept expecting to find the thing Rick Prime cared about that he could threaten. There wasn't one. And Rick, whose genius is so often built on finding the vulnerability in a system and exploiting it, had no move prepared for a system with no vulnerability. Because a system with no vulnerability, with no caring, no attachment, no love, isn't a superior system, it's a broken one. And Rick had spent so long thinking of Rick Prime as the ultimate version of what Rick could be that he didn't quite see it as broken. He saw it as threatening. There's a question worth asking about what Rick Prime wanted from the original visit to Rick's household. He didn't just come to extend an invitation. He came with a weapon. He came with what reads, in context, as a test. Come with me, or I'll show you what happens to those who stay behind. Rick refused, and Rick Prime did what he said he'd do. What does it mean that Rick Prime killed Diane? It's monstrous, obviously, but it's also a communication. Rick Prime was showing Rick what attachment costs. Look what your caring lets me do to you. Look what staying does. Look what love makes possible for someone who doesn't love. And Rick spent decades answering that communication. Not by becoming Rick Prime, by refusing to become him, by staying attached, staying connected, staying the version of Rick who kept choosing the family, even when the family was complicated and painful and not the universe-spanning adventure that was apparently on offer. Rick Prime wanted to free Rick from love. Rick refused. And then Rick spent 20 years chasing the man who taught him that refusal has a price. The tragedy of the Rick Prime arc is precisely that it reveals how much Rick's entire post-Diane life has been a response to trauma. Every adventure, every invention, every portal opened into another universe. All of it happening inside the framework of a loss that Rick never fully processed. A grief that got converted into purpose. A wound that became a mission, because a mission is easier to carry than grief. Rick underestimated how much Rick Prime had already shaped him, not just through the killing of Diane, though that was the original rupture, but through what that killing set in motion. Rick Prime didn't just take Diane. He gave Rick a reason to become the man he became. The genius who crossed every line, who operated without limits, who built his own rules because conventional rules couldn't serve the scale of what he was working toward. Rick Prime created the conditions for the Rick Sanchez we know. And Rick Sanchez spent decades defining himself against a man who, in a dark and awful way, made him what he is. What's the lesson of Rick Prime, in the context of this documentary's argument? It's that even the most intelligent person in the universe cannot think clearly about their deepest wound. The wound changes the thinking. It introduces a bias so fundamental, so close to the center of the self, that the normal clarity doesn't reach it. Rick can outsmart civilizations and build technologies that rewrite physical law, but he cannot apply that same dispassion to his own grief, his own loss, his own 20-year obsession. He's not superhuman. He's human. Extraordinarily capable, but human. And the thing that makes us human, the attachment, the grief, the love that persists past reason, is also the thing that makes us vulnerable in ways intelligence can't fully protect against. Rick Prime knew this and used it. Rick knew this intellectually and still couldn't defend against it, because you cannot defend against your own humanity from the inside. Rick Sanchez went looking for Rick Prime and found, when it was over, that the mission's end didn't end the grief. That killing Rick Prime didn't restore Diane. That revenge, which had been the organizing principle of decades, was not actually what he needed, and had never been what he needed. And some part of him probably knew this. He underestimated Rick Prime's emotional invulnerability. But the deeper underestimation was of himself, of what he actually needed, of what would actually help, of what the grief was actually asking for. Which was not resolution through violence, which was maybe what Rick has been slowly finding his way toward through this family he keeps returning to. Presence. Actual presence, not as a cover identity or a shelter from the mission, as a real relationship with people he loves. The smartest man in the universe needed decades to figure out that the thing he was running from was also the thing that could save him. He's not there yet. He might be getting closer. Chapter 8. Small characters, big consequences. Not every underestimation Rick makes involves someone he loves. Some of the most revealing failures in Rick's history involve people he met once. People he dismissed in 30 seconds or less. People whose names he probably didn't bother to learn. Characters who appeared for one episode, made one choice, and changed something in Rick's world in ways he didn't see coming. Not because they were secretly brilliant or running a long game, but simply because Rick decided they weren't worth his attention and they turned out to matter. This chapter is about those people. The ones the camera moved past. The ones Rick filed under not relevant and kept walking. The ones who, because Rick stopped looking, got to do things Rick didn't account for. They're everywhere in this show. Once you start noticing, you can't stop. Rick's attention is a finite resource. This sounds strange. Rick processes information at a speed that should make comprehensive attention possible. But attention isn't just processing speed. Attention is about what you decide is worth processing in the first place. And Rick has a very narrow definition of what's worth processing. Threats to his plan. Variables that affect the outcome he's targeting. People with the capability to meaningfully interfere with what he's doing. Everyone else gets a categorical dismissal. Their background, scenery, the population of a given planet or dimension or situation that Rick is passing through on his way to something else. The problem with this approach is that the background has agency. The scenery makes choices. The population of whatever world Rick is moving through has its own goals and its own logic and its own reactions to Rick's presence. And those reactions don't stop happening just because Rick stopped paying attention. Rick leaves footprints, and the things that step in those footprints, while Rick is already 3 dimensions away, keep going. Meeseeks and Destroy gives us Mr. Meeseeks, who is perhaps the most famous small character in the show's early run. Meeseeks are summoned entities, blue, cheerful, desperate to complete a task and cease to exist. Rick introduces them as a solution to the family's minor problems and moves on, confident that the Meeseeks box is a controlled system he fully understands. The system is not controlled. Jerry's inability to improve his golf swing creates a Meeseeks that can't fulfill its purpose and therefore can't cease to exist, which, for a Meeseeks, is existential torture. More Meeseeks get summoned to help. They multiply. Their desperation compounds. What began as a simple household utility becomes a small army of increasingly unhinged beings teetering on the edge of collapse. Rick didn't think this would happen, not because the math was hard. In retrospect, the failure mode is obvious. A being that can only stop suffering by completing its task, applied to an impossible task, will eventually break down. Rick missed it because he didn't think Jerry's task would be difficult enough to matter. He assigned the Meeseeks to Jerry's problem because Jerry's problem was beneath Rick's engagement threshold. He underestimated Jerry's incompetence, which fed back into a miscalculation about the Meeseeks, which created a crisis that required actual attention to resolve. Small characters, small dismissal, cascading consequences. The Zygarians are a species of scammers introduced in Night Shame Aliens, a civilization that captures Rick in a simulation and tries to extract his concentrated dark matter formula. They're not impressive. Their simulation is buggy. Their plan has obvious holes. They're, as Rick immediately recognizes, not operating anywhere near his level. He beats them easily. He feeds them a fake formula. Escapes. They're destroyed when their ship explodes because they tried to make the fake formula work. Rick won, completely, without breaking a sweat. But here's what's interesting. The Zygarians represent the failure mode that runs in the other direction. Rick is so certain of his superiority over them that his contempt becomes a kind of carelessness. He doesn't fully engage with what they're doing or why. He beats them and dismisses them and moves on, which is efficient, but it leaves questions unasked. Why did they target him specifically? What did they actually learn, even from the false formula? Are there more Zygarians? Is this species going to try again with a better simulation? Rick doesn't ask, because why would he? He already won. This isn't a case where the dismissal creates an immediate catastrophe, but it's a case where Rick's contempt for a species he correctly identifies as beneath him also closes off his curiosity about them, and his curiosity is usually his greatest asset. When Rick cares enough to be curious, he's nearly invincible. When he dismisses something as not worth being curious about, he closes a door that might have been worth opening. Vindicators 3. The Return of World Ender gives us the Vindicators, a superhero team that Rick and Morty have previously worked with, who've continued their heroic career without Rick. Rick clearly has a complicated history with them, one built on the same contempt for others' capabilities that runs through everything. What's fascinating here is that Rick designed a death trap for them, while blackout drunk. A death trap calibrated to their specific weaknesses, their specific failure modes, their specific character flaws. And it's more sophisticated than anything the Vindicators could have built for Rick, because Rick actually paid attention to them, even as he claimed not to care about them. This is a reveal about Rick's relationship to underestimation that the show doesn't make explicit, but that's visible if you're looking. Rick dismisses people loudly and studies them quietly. He tells you the Vindicators don't matter, while simultaneously cataloging their psychological vulnerabilities with enough precision to build personalized lethal challenges for each of them. The dismissal is the performance, the attention is real, and the one who survives, Noob, the janitor whom Rick barely registered, turns out to be the one Rick remembers, with something approaching fondness in his blackout memories. Noob was the one who laughed at Rick's jokes. That's it. That's all it took for Rick to unconsciously prioritize someone. Not capability, not intelligence, just the specific, simple act of laughing at his jokes. Rick, who claims to be above needing approval, unconsciously cataloged the janitor who gave it to him and forgot the heroes he was supposed to be helping. That's almost unbearably human. The Ricks Must Be Crazy has the miniverse and the microverse, the civilizations Rick created inside his car battery to generate power. Rick built an entire civilization of intelligent beings and told them nothing about their true purpose or situation. They exist to power his car. Their entire history, their science, their philosophy, all of it developed in the context of a reality Rick manufactured and maintains through deception. One of the miniverse scientists, Zeep Zanflorp, figures out the truth. He builds his own miniverse for his own power source. He's doing to his civilization exactly what Rick is doing to his. Rick is outraged by this, which is funny and revealing. Rick considers Zeep's miniverse a moral outrage because it means Zeep's people are enslaved to generate power, seemingly unaware that this is precisely what Rick has done to Zeep's people. But here's the underestimation. Rick didn't predict Zeep. He built a civilization of intelligent beings and didn't model for the possibility that some of them would be intelligent enough to figure out what he'd done and replicate his own methodology. He created the conditions for Zeep and then was surprised by Zeep. When you create intelligent life and don't account for the full range of what intelligence can do, including turn your own logic against you, you haven't fully thought through the creation. Rick thought through the physics. He didn't think through the people. Pickle Rick gives us Jaguar, the prisoner who becomes a strange one-episode ally. Jaguar is introduced as a credible physical threat and then becomes something the episode doesn't quite prepare you for. Someone with genuine humanity in a situation designed to strip humanity away. He has a daughter. That's the whole thing. That's what makes him more than a hired gun. Rick, who has a granddaughter and a daughter and a family he keeps returning to, processes this information and uses it, leverages it as a tactical fact rather than sitting with it as a human parallel to his own situation. He notes that Jaguar's attachment to his daughter is the thing that can be appealed to and appeals to it, without pausing to notice that the attachment they're leveraging in Jaguar is exactly the attachment Rick pretends he doesn't have. Rick moves through people who could be mirrors and doesn't look in them. Morty's Mind Blowers establishes that Rick has been selectively editing Morty's memories, removing the ones where Rick was wrong, where Rick made mistakes, where Rick failed in ways that would damage Morty's confidence in him. There's a whole collection of these, a shelf of suppressed moments where Rick got it wrong and didn't want Morty to know. The small characters in this episode are all the people in those suppressed memories who Rick misread and who Morty subsequently suffered for. Each blower is a case study in Rick's overconfidence, situations where Rick was certain and wrong, and rather than letting Morty keep the knowledge of the wrongness, Rick cleaned it up and kept the model intact. This is the purest distillation of the underestimation problem in the whole show. Rick doesn't just underestimate people in the moment. He actively removes the evidence of his underestimations to preserve the fiction that he doesn't underestimate people. The failures get erased. The model never gets updated because the update evidence keeps disappearing. Rick built a mechanism for preventing himself from learning from his mistakes. That's terrifying, and it explains a lot. The simple Rick Wafer Factory subplot in the Ricklantis mix-up contains its own small character moment. Simple Rick is a Rick who found happiness in ordinary domestic life, a Rick who genuinely loves his family without the complicated architecture of detachment, and the Citadel found a use for him. They harvest his happy memories to flavor cookies. It's horrifying. But the small character point here is about the Ricks who built this system and who keep it running. They looked at Simple Rick and saw a resource. They looked at his happiness and saw something to be extracted. They couldn't compute a Rick finding genuine contentment in ordinary things as anything other than a malfunction to be monetized. And they missed, all of them, the entire administrative apparatus of the Citadel, that Simple Rick's contentment was not a malfunction. It was a different choice, a valid one. Maybe the more honest one. The Citadel of Ricks built an institution around dismissing the Ricks who chose differently. And the whole institution, as we know, eventually fell because it was structured on a foundation of underestimation, of mortis, of ordinary Ricks, of anyone who didn't fit the dominant model of what a Rick should be. There's a through line connecting all these small characters, all these one-episode presences, all these background figures who made choices Rick didn't account for. It's not that they're secretly brilliant. It's not that they were running plans Rick couldn't predict. It's simpler than that. They were just real. They had their own logic, their own needs, their own responses to what Rick did in their vicinity. And Rick, moving through at Rick speed with Rick priorities, kept not giving that logic the time it deserved. Some of them created problems because Rick dismissed them. Some of them created problems because Rick managed them without fully understanding them. Some of them created problems because Rick did something in their world and then left without considering the consequences for the people who had to live there after he was gone. He leaves. They stay. And the staying has consequences. The universe is not a series of problems waiting for Rick to solve them. The universe is full of beings living their own lives with their own stakes. And when Rick moves through their lives, which he does constantly, at enormous velocity, he disrupts things in ways he doesn't always track. He's not the only protagonist of every story he enters. He just plays the role like he is. And every person he dismisses, every small character who gets filed away as background, every one of them has a story that keeps going after Rick leaves the frame. Some of those stories come back around. Rick is never quite ready when they do. Chapter 9. Intelligence isn't everything. Put them all in a room together. Rick, Morty, Jerry, Summer, Beth, Evil Morty. The full cast of people this documentary has been tracking. The ones Rick underestimated, the ones who surprised him, the ones who kept being more than the categories he assigned them. Look at what they've each managed to do. Look at where Rick's intelligence ends and where their different kinds of capability begin. Not to diminish Rick, he's still the smartest person in the room by almost any conventional measure. But a room full of people who each succeed in ways Rick cannot is worth examining carefully. Because what it reveals is that intelligence, the specific kind Rick has and wields, and has organized his entire identity around, is one way to navigate the world. A very powerful way, an often decisive way, but not the only way. And sometimes, in specific situations that the universe keeps arranging with suspicious frequency, not even the most effective way. Start with what intelligence actually is. Because the word gets used loosely, and Rick's version of it is specific. Rick's intelligence is primarily analytical and synthetic. He can model complex systems, predict cascading outcomes, synthesize information from disparate fields into novel solutions, and process all of this at a speed that makes everyone around him look like they're thinking in slow motion. He can build a portal gun in a garage. He can hold the architecture of a solution to a problem no one else could even fully articulate. This is extraordinary. It's genuinely extraordinary. The show never asks you to forget this. But intelligence is a much larger category than Rick's version of it. Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences maps roughly onto what Rick and Morty is doing with its characters. Logical mathematical intelligence is Rick's primary mode. But there's also emotional intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, intrapersonal intelligence, moral intelligence, and a cluster of social and adaptive capabilities that are real forms of cognitive sophistication even if they don't produce portal guns. Each person in Rick's orbit excels in a mode Rick doesn't fully inhabit, and each of those modes, at key moments, outperforms what Rick can do. Morty's intelligence is emotional and moral. Morty can read situations through their human cost in a way Rick doesn't naturally do. He tracks how people are feeling, what they need, where the suffering is in a given situation, and he responds to that suffering with an immediacy that Rick has to consciously choose and usually doesn't. This isn't soft. In the kind of universe Rick and Morty move through, where the solutions Rick finds often have enormous human costs, where the technically correct answer frequently involves sacrificing someone, where winning by Rick's metric sometimes means something monstrous by any other metric, Morty's moral orientation is a genuine corrective. Morty has stopped Rick from doing things that Rick, purely by his own logic, would have done. Not by out-arguing him. Morty rarely wins the intellectual argument. By appealing to something Rick still has but can't always access on his own. The part of Rick that knows, underneath the calculations, that people aren't variables. There's a kind of intelligence in that. The kind that tracks the full ledger of a situation rather than just the winning outcome. The kind that asks not just, did we solve the problem, but what did solving the problem cost, and was that cost worth paying? Rick mostly asks the first question. Morty keeps asking the second. You need both questions. A life built only on Rick's question is Pickle Rick alone in a sewer, solving a brilliant problem that didn't need to exist. A life built only on Morty's question is paralysis, caring so much about cost that no action is ever worth taking. Together they're more complete than either is alone. Rick doesn't acknowledge this. Jerry's intelligence is social and connective. Jerry knows how to be with people, not how to impress them, not how to outthink them, not how to leverage them, how to be with them, how to occupy the same space with someone and make them feel that occupying that space is worthwhile. How to engage with what someone is saying rather than waiting for his turn to say the smarter thing. This is an actual skill. It's one of the most valuable social skills there is. And it's completely orthogonal to Rick's mode, which is why Rick can't see it as a skill. To Rick it looks like absence. The absence of impressiveness. The absence of capability. But there are situations, and life is mostly made of these situations, where what's needed isn't someone brilliant. What's needed is someone present. Someone warm. Someone who makes the people around them feel seen rather than assessed. Jerry fills rooms differently than Rick fills rooms. Rick fills rooms with his intelligence. Everything orients around it, everyone adjusts to it. The whole social dynamic restructures itself to accommodate Rick's presence. That's powerful. It's also exhausting. And it means Rick can never just be in a room. He's always the event. Jerry can just be in a room. That sounds trivial. It's not. The ability to be present without needing to be the center, to let other people take up space, to let conversations breathe, to not need to dominate every interaction, is a kind of social grace that makes ordinary life actually livable. Rick's presence is a constant high-pressure event. Jerry's presence is a place where the pressure drops. Both matter. You need days that are high-pressure events, and you need days where the pressure drops. Rick only knows how to create one of them. Jerry only knows how to create the other. But in the long run, for the purpose of actually building a sustainable life with people you love, Jerry's skill is arguably more necessary. Summer's intelligence is adaptive and contextual. Summer reads environments the way Rick reads equations. She walks into a social situation and immediately understands its structure. Who has power, who wants what the unspoken rules are, where the pressure points are. This is not trivial intelligence. This is the kind of cognitive sophistication that runs massive amounts of social computation in real time, mostly without the person doing it being aware of how much work it is. Rick moves through social situations by overriding them. He enters and restructures everything around his presence. Summer moves through social situations by understanding them first and then deciding how to engage on informed terms. These are different strategies, and Rick's is often more effective in the short term. Walking in and taking over gets the outcome faster. But Summer's strategy produces better long-term relationships, more sustainable alliances, more genuine understanding of the people she's dealing with. Rick burns bridges he doesn't know he's burning because he never studied the bridge. Summer notices the bridge and decides whether it's worth crossing carefully or worth burning depending on what she's actually trying to accomplish. There's also Summer's adaptive resilience, the way she adjusts to new information without losing herself. Rick processes new information analytically, which means he either integrates it into his existing model or discards it. Summer processes new information personally, which means she asks what it means for her and then adjusts her self-understanding accordingly. She grows as a result of what happens to her in a way that changes who she is without changing that she is. Rick has trouble with that kind of growth. He has trouble with growth that touches the self rather than the intellect. Because growth that touches the self requires admitting that the self before the growth was incomplete. And Rick's identity doesn't easily accommodate incompleteness. Beth's intelligence is analytical and emotional in a combination that Rick recognizes but doesn't fully value. Beth has Rick's analytical mind. She genuinely does. The show isn't flattering her when it shows her making complex, rapid assessments of situations. She has the cold pragmatism, the willingness to cut through sentiment to get to a workable solution, the capacity for difficult truths. What she has that Rick doesn't is the analytical mind applied to emotional material. Beth does the work of understanding her own psychology, imperfectly, incompletely, with plenty of self-deception in the mix, but she does it. She goes to therapy, she reflects, she asks herself why she makes the choices she makes, and occasionally, she gets real answers that she then has to sit with. Rick finds this kind of introspection unnecessary at best and destabilizing at worst. He knows himself, or believes he knows himself, which is a different thing. The idea that there might be architecture inside him that he hasn't examined, that his motivations might be more complicated than his stated reasons for things, that the smartest man in the universe might have blind spots about his own inner life. This is a threat Rick manages by not engaging with it. Beth engages with it. She's not great at it, but she tries. She faces herself in a way Rick consistently refuses to. That takes a kind of courage Rick doesn't have. Evil Morty's intelligence is strategic and systemic. Rick thinks fast and acts faster. He's brilliant in the moment, in the crisis, in the situation that requires immediate response. Evil Morty thinks slow. He builds. He plays the long game in a way Rick rarely attempts. He can hold a plan across years without losing patience, without seeking validation, without needing to show his hand before the time is right. This is a different mode of intelligence from Rick's. Not necessarily greater overall, but greater in the specific dimension of patience. Rick's genius is dazzling in its immediacy. Evil Morty's genius is dazzling in its restraint. Rick keeps moving. Evil Morty keeps waiting. And what Evil Morty understood that Rick didn't was that sometimes waiting is more powerful than moving. Sometimes the smartest move is to let the other person keep acting on their assumptions while you quietly work toward a conclusion they're not even scanning for. Rick's speed is his gift and his limitation. It means he's always 3 moves ahead in the current game and sometimes not even playing the game that's actually happening. Let's go further than the main cast, because the show's secondary and minor characters make this argument too. Dr. Wong in Pickle Rick demonstrates a kind of intelligence Rick specifically undervalues. The intelligence of human observation across time. She's a therapist. She doesn't have Rick's processing speed. She can't build a portal gun. She couldn't survive most of Rick's adventures for 5 minutes. But she sits across from Rick Sanchez in a 1-hour session and diagnoses him with a precision that makes Rick uncomfortable enough to never go back. She knows what she's looking at because she's looked at it before. In different people, in different configurations. The intelligence of pattern recognition across human behavior, built slowly through years of careful attention to what people do and why, is something Rick's speed doesn't give him. Rick makes models. Dr. Wong reads people, and reading people accumulated slowly through thousands of hours of listening carefully produces an accuracy that modeling can't always match. Rick left that session knowing something about himself he couldn't unknow. Dr. Wong did that. In 1 hour. Without a single piece of technology. Unity, the hive mind Rick loved, the entity that could control entire planets. One of the few beings Rick engaged with something approaching genuine emotional openness, demonstrates a different kind of intelligence entirely. The intelligence of scale. Unity processes the experience of billions simultaneously. It knows what individual experience feels like, multiplied by a number Rick's scale can barely model. It understands crowd dynamics, mass psychology, collective behavior in a way that's completely outside Rick's framework, which is always fundamentally individual. Their relationship fails. Rick is genuinely bad for unity. His influence corrupts the hive, introduces his specific brand of nihilistic excess into the collective consciousness. But what's worth noting is that unity, facing Rick, has to make a hard choice. and makes it. It writes Rick a letter. It leaves. It does the thing that's right for the collective even though it clearly hurts to do it. Rick couldn't have made that choice. Rick has never successfully chosen the right thing when the right thing required removing himself from a situation. Unity chose that. It required a kind of emotional intelligence, the ability to love something and let it go when keeping it is harmful, that Rick has not yet demonstrated he possesses. What does this all mean when you look at it together? It means the show has spent its entire run building a portrait of intelligence that is much wider than Rick's definition. Rick defines intelligence as the ability to solve problems faster and more elegantly than anyone else. And by that definition, he's almost always winning. But the universe Rick inhabits keeps presenting him with problems his definition can't solve. Problems that require emotional presence, or long-term patience, or moral clarity, or social grace, or the ability to love something without needing to control it, or the willingness to be wrong and update, or the courage to face yourself honestly. Rick has workarounds for some of these. He can approximate emotional presence when he needs to. He can engage with moral questions when he's forced to. He can love his family in the specific oblique way he loves them. But workarounds aren't the thing. Approximations aren't the thing. And the people around Rick, the ones he underestimated, the ones he categorized and filed away, keep demonstrating the real thing. The genuine article. The actual capability rather than the workaround. Rick succeeds at enormous things. Universe-scale things. Things that genuinely matter in the cosmic sense that Rick operates in. Morty succeeds at human things, staying present, growing up, caring for people without losing himself. Jerry succeeds at ordinary things, being genuine, building warmth, making people feel valued. Summer succeeds at adaptive things, reading environments, staying herself under pressure, moving through difficulty without being defined by it. Beth succeeds at honest things, facing her own psychology, staying when it's hard, choosing her life with open eyes. Evil Morty succeeded at systemic things, long-game thinking, patient accumulation, the decision to leave the structure that was harming him. None of these are the same kind of success. None of them are interchangeable. You can't substitute Rick's cosmic wins for Morty's human ones. They're not in the same category. You can't replace Jerry's warmth with Rick's brilliance. They solve different problems. What you can do is notice that Rick has been measuring everyone around him on his scale and finding them lacking, while failing to notice that they're succeeding on scales he doesn't use. That's the category error. That's the heart of the underestimation. Rick keeps using the wrong ruler. Here's the synthesis. Intelligence, in the broad sense, the capacity to effectively navigate the world, is distributed across Rick's family and orbit in ways that Rick's specific definition makes invisible to him. He can see his own intelligence clearly. He cannot see theirs, because what they have doesn't register on the instruments he uses for measurement. His instruments are calibrated for his kind of intelligence and return blank readings for everything else. That's not a problem with the people around him, that's a problem with the instruments. And the tragedy, if tragedy is the right word, is that Rick built the instruments himself. He designed the measurements. He chose what counted. He could choose differently. He hasn't yet. But everyone around him has been quietly demonstrating, for years, that there's a whole spectrum of human capacity he hasn't built the tools to measure. Maybe someday he'll build the tools. He's certainly smart enough. Chapter 10. Rick's Greatest Blind Spot. We've been building towards something. Not a conclusion exactly. Not the kind of ending where everything resolves and the lesson is stated and the documentary closes on a note of comfortable certainty. That's not what this story is, and it's not what Rick Sanchez is. But there's something here. Something the whole run of the show has been assembling. Piece by piece, character by character, underestimation by underestimation. Something that becomes visible when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. Rick Sanchez is the smartest man in the universe, and his greatest blind spot is what that means. Not whether it's true, whether it matters. Those are different questions. Rick has spent decades treating them as the same question. If you're the smartest, it matters, completely, in every situation, as the defining variable that settles every argument and determines every hierarchy. Intelligence is the metric. He built his entire sense of himself around it, his self-worth, his relationships, his understanding of other people, his place in the cosmos, all of it organized around the fact that he can outthink anything he encounters. The blind spot isn't that Rick overestimated his intelligence. The blind spot is that he overestimated intelligence itself. He looked at the most powerful tool he had and decided it was the only tool that mattered. He looked at the most extraordinary quality he possessed and decided it was the measure of all things. He built a universe, the central finite curve, literally, but also the personal universe he lives inside every day, organized around the primacy of intelligence, and then lived in that universe for so long that he forgot it was something he built rather than something he discovered. Intelligence isn't the measure of all things. Rick knows this. Somewhere, he has to know it. He's too smart not to have encountered the evidence. He's watched Morty make the right call when Rick's calculation was cold. He's watched Jerry's decency hold a line Rick would have abandoned. He's watched Summer handle situations with a grounded competence that his genius couldn't replicate. He's watched Beth face herself with a courage he's never found. He's had the evidence delivered to him, repeatedly, across years of living with these people. He keeps not updating. Why? That's the question the whole documentary has been circling. Why does someone with Rick's intellectual capacity keep making the same category of mistake? Why does the most analytical mind in the universe fail to apply analysis to the pattern of its own failures? The answer lives somewhere at the intersection of identity and fear. Rick's intelligence isn't just something he has, it's everything he is. Strip away the genius, and there's nothing Rick has built a self around. No emotional foundation, because he sealed that off after Diane. No community, because he burns through communities the way he burns through universes. No stable relationships, because stability requires the kind of vulnerability Rick has spent decades refusing. No philosophy that provides comfort, because he's too smart for comfortable philosophies and too damaged for honest ones. There is the intelligence. There is the thing he can do that no one else can do. There is the one quality that explains why Rick Sanchez exists and why his existence matters. If intelligence is the measure of all things and Rick is the most intelligent, then Rick's existence is justified. Meaningful, significant in a way that requires no further argument. But if intelligence isn't the only measure, if Morty's emotional clarity matters, if Jerry's decency matters, if Summer's adaptability matters, if Beth's self-knowledge matters, then Rick's existence is significant for reasons that have nothing to do with being the smartest. It's significant because he loves people and is loved by them. Because he keeps showing up, even when showing up is hard, even when he pretends not to care. Because there's something in him that chooses, over and over, to be part of this family rather than to exist alone in the infinite multiverse where no one can reach him. That version of Rick's significance is more vulnerable. It depends on the people around him in a way the genius version doesn't. It means that what makes his life matter is partly held by Morty and Beth and Summer and even Jerry, people Rick has categorized as lesser, people Rick has spent years managing and dismissing, people Rick can't control. That's terrifying if you're Rick. So instead, he keeps insisting on the genius version. He keeps measuring everything by the one metric he wins. He keeps looking at the people he loves and seeing what they lack rather than what they have, because what they have is the evidence that he needs them. And needing people is the one thing Rick Sanchez has never fully allowed himself to do. The underestimations, traced from the beginning of this documentary to the end, form a portrait. It's not a portrait of a villain. Rick Sanchez is not a villain in any meaningful sense, even when he does villainous things. It's not a portrait of someone who doesn't care. The evidence of his caring is everywhere, in every choice to return to the family, in every sacrifice he made that he immediately covered with a quip, in every quiet moment where the armor slipped and something real showed through. It's a portrait of someone who is very, very afraid. Afraid of what it would mean to fully see the people around him. Because fully seeing them means admitting they matter. And admitting they matter means admitting he can lose them. And losing them, really losing them, in the way he lost Diane, is the thing that already broke him once and that he spent decades engineering his life to prevent experiencing again. The underestimation is a defense mechanism. Not keeping Morty small to feel tall. Keeping Morty categorized to avoid the full weight of loving him. Not dismissing Jerry to feel superior. Dismissing Jerry to avoid examining what Jerry's steadiness reveals about Rick's own restlessness. Not failing to see Summer to preserve status. Failing to see Summer because seeing her fully would require seeing someone who became remarkable without Rick's guidance, which is both a source of pride and a reminder that Rick was absent for most of it. The people Rick loves have grown in the space his absence created. Looking at that clearly would cost him something. So he doesn't look. Not all the way, not yet. There's a moment, and the show gives you these rarely, where Rick is honest, not performing honesty, not strategically disclosing something to gain tactical advantage, but actually honest, quiet and undefended, and present with what's real. These moments are almost always brief. Rick feels the exposure and closes it, but they're there. They've been there throughout the series. The look on his face when Morty makes a decision Rick didn't expect and gets it right. The pause before a dismissal of Jerry that doesn't quite land the way dismissals used to. The way Rick talks about Beth when Beth isn't in the room and he thinks no one is paying attention. The small, quickly buried moments of something like wonder when Summer does something he didn't see coming. In those moments, the model isn't running. The automatic categorization isn't happening. Rick is just there, with the actual person, responding to who they actually are, rather than who he decided they were. Those are the moments the show treasures most. They're the moments Rick is most himself. Let's talk about what updating would actually cost Rick. Not abstractly, concretely. If Rick revised his models of Morty and Jerry and Summer and Beth to be accurate, rather than convenient, what would he have to accept? He would have to accept that Morty's moral intelligence is real and valuable and not just a sentimental overcorrection of Rick's own detachment. He would have to accept that Jerry's decency is a genuine quality that Rick lacks and that the lack is a loss. He would have to accept that Summer became extraordinary without Rick making her that way, which means the extraordinary things people become aren't always traceable back to Rick. He would have to accept that Beth's wounds are partly his fault, in ways that she chose her own life doesn't fully excuse. He would have to accept that Evil Morty was partially made possible by the system Rick endorsed and participated in. He would have to accept that Rick Prime shaped him, still shapes him, and that the life Rick built in response to losing Diane has been partly a grief project running beneath everything else. That is an enormous amount to accept. Most people couldn't hold all of that at once. The cognitive and emotional weight of a full, accurate self-inventory, including your role in the harm you've caused. That's a heavy accounting even for someone without Rick's history. Rick has enough history to fill multiple lifetimes. The weight of full honesty would be almost unbearable, so he carries the lighter load of the model instead. The one where he's always ahead. The one where he already knows everyone. The one where the categorizations protect him from the full impact of what's actually true. That's the blind spot, not a failure of intelligence. A choice to protect himself from the cost of full seeing. What does the show want us to take from this? Not that Rick should become humble. Humility performed isn't the same as something actually shifting inside a person, and Rick performing humility would be its own kind of dishonesty. Not that Rick should become more like Jerry, or more like Morty, or more like anyone else. Rick is most valuable as Rick. His particular, specific, irreplaceable quality is the thing, what the show keeps gesturing toward, in its dark humor and its quiet moments and its long arcs and its brief flashes of genuine emotional honesty, is something subtler, that Rick could love these people more completely than he currently does. Not more intensely. The intensity is already there, buried, enormous. More completely. More openly. With less management and less categorization, and less of the protective distance that keeps him from being fully hurt by them and also keeps him from being fully with them. That's all. That's the whole lesson, condensed. Rick could stay. Not just physically, he keeps doing that. He could stay emotionally, could be present in the ordinary Tuesday moments he keeps skipping, could revise the models, could let Morty surprise him, could tell Jerry something honest, could see Summer, could sit with Beth in the full complexity of who she is and what he contributed to making her. He could do all of that. He hasn't yet. Here's what's true though, and the show earns the right to say it because it's spent so many episodes building toward it. Rick keeps coming back, against his stated philosophy, against the nihilism and the detachment and the infinite freedom of being able to go literally anywhere else. Against every intellectual argument he could make for why this specific family, in this specific dimension, in this specific ordinary house, shouldn't matter more than the rest of the universe. He keeps coming back. That's not nothing. That might be everything. It might be the one piece of evidence that matters most, more than any specific moment of growth, or acknowledgement, or fleeting honesty. Rick Sanchez, the smartest man in the universe, who could be anywhere, keeps choosing to be here. The models might be wrong, the categorizations might be outdated, the underestimations might keep happening because Rick hasn't fully built the courage yet to see the people he loves as clearly as they deserve to be seen. but he comes back to them, every time. And whatever else that means about Rick Sanchez, whatever the psychologists and the philosophers and the documentary writers say about his blind spots and his defenses and his decades of miscalculated assessments, that choice is real. That pattern is real. And it points towards something underneath all the genius and all the armor that Rick might not have words for, but that keeps overriding his own arguments for leaving. He loves them. He's just not very good at it yet. The characters this documentary followed, Morty, Evil Morty, Jerry, Summer, Beth, Rick Prime, the small figures in the background, they all taught Rick something. Not through lessons he accepted gracefully, through consequences he had to survive, through surprises he couldn't explain away, through moments where his model failed and reality walked through the gap. Morty taught him that the people you dismiss as lesser are often carrying something you need. Evil Morty taught him that the people you overlook are capable of changing the entire world you built. Jerry taught him that the things he can't measure might still matter. Summer taught him that growth doesn't need his permission. Beth taught him that the wounds he caused have to be looked at, eventually. Rick Prime taught him that going all the way isn't freedom. It's just a different kind of trap. The small characters taught him that everyone who passes through a life leaves something in it, even when you're not watching, especially when you're not watching. None of these lessons have been fully integrated. Rick doesn't graduate from this documentary a wiser man. He doesn't sit down with his family and acknowledge the specific ways he underestimated each of them and thank them for continuing to be more than he expected. He doesn't write an essay about the limits of intelligence and deliver it at Morty's graduation. He's Rick Sanchez. He'll probably build something instead. He'll probably make a quip. He'll probably deflect the emotional weight of the thing into a dimension where it can't touch him for another few episodes. But something accumulates. That's the thing the show trusts, and the thing this documentary has been tracking. Not a single dramatic change, but a slow, reluctant, practically invisible accumulation. Each underestimation that doesn't go the way Rick expected adds one more data point to a file he doesn't want to open. Each moment of genuine surprise, Morty making the right call, Jerry holding the line, Summer showing up where Rick didn't account for her, adds to a weight Rick has been carrying for years, the weight of evidence against his own model. At some point, the weight becomes undeniable. Rick isn't there yet, but he's carrying more than he used to. Perhaps the most honest thing this documentary can say, after all the chapters, all the characters, all the careful tracing of what Rick got wrong and why, is that Rick's greatest defeats were never really about enemies. They were about assumptions. He assumed he already knew what Morty was. He assumed Evil Morty was contained within the category of what a Morty could do. He assumed Jerry was fully described by what Jerry lacked. He assumed Summer was peripheral to the story. He assumed Beth was comprehensible through the parts of her that resembled him. He assumed Rick Prime could be understood through the lens of revenge, that the resolution would feel like a resolution, that decades of grief converted into purpose would finally pay off cleanly when the target was found. None of it worked the way the model said it would. Because models aren't people, and this is the one thing Rick's intelligence keeps failing to fully predict. People keep making choices, keep growing, keep being something the model didn't account for, keep arriving in their own lives with their own logic and their own capacity for surprise, and the surprise doesn't stop coming just because you're the smartest person in the room. The universe is full of people Rick passed by without fully seeing. The ones who lived in his house did the most damage to his certainty. The ones who loved him and kept loving him and kept being more than he expected, they've been teaching him something for years. Maybe someday he'll finish learning it. The smartest man in the universe has been a slow student in the only class that matters, but he keeps showing up for it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's where it starts.